The Hunter's Shadow. Thomas Red Sky adjusted the shoulder strap of his rifle for the third time in 10 minutes, the familiar weight of the Winchester 30-06 both comforting and somehow inadequate against the growing unease that had settled in his chest like cold water. The October morning air in the Cascade Range carried the sharp bite of early winter, and he could see his breath misting as he picked his way through the dense understory of Douglas fir and western hemlock. He'd been hunting these mountains of Washington state for 23 years, ever since his grandfather had first brought him up here as a scrawny 12-year-old from the Tulalip Reservation. But something felt different today, wrong. The silence was the first thing that struck him as unnatural. No squirrel chatter, no bird calls. Even the ever-present whisper of wind through the canopy had stilled to an oppressive quiet that made his footfalls on the carpet of decomposing leaves sound unnaturally loud. Thomas paused beside a massive cedar trunk, its bark scarred and blackened from some long-ago lightning strike, and listened. Nothing. Not even the distant drum of a woodpecker or the rustle of small creatures foraging in the underbrush. He'd left his cabin at 4:30 that morning, well before dawn, driving his beat-up Ford pickup along the logging roads that snaked up into the Olympic National Forest. The plan was simple: spend the day tracking the elk herd he'd spotted moving through this drainage the week before, maybe bag a bull if he got lucky. Thomas worked as a fishing guide during the summer months, taking wealthy tourists out on the Sound for salmon, but autumn was his time, his grandfather's time. The time when the Red Sky men went into the mountains to fill the freezer and honor the old agreements with the land. But 40 minutes into his hunt, with the GPS reading 47.8 degrees north and 123.2 degrees west, Thomas was beginning to think he should have stayed in bed. The smell hit him when he crested a small ridge overlooking what the topographic maps labeled as Hoe Creek, though the actual waterway was more of a seasonal trickle cutting through a narrow ravine below. It was subtle at first, barely registering above the rich organic scent of rotting wood and wet earth. But as he descended toward the creek bottom, threading between vine maple and salmonberry thickets, the odor grew stronger and more distinct. Blood. Thomas had been around death enough to recognize the metallic, copper-sweet smell of fresh blood. Predator kills, gut piles from successful hunts, the occasional road-killed deer. It was all part of life in the woods, but this was different, stronger. There was something else mixed in with it, something musky and wild that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He found the source 20 yards downstream from where he'd first crossed the creek. The elk was a young bull, maybe 2 years old, with antlers just beginning to show the promise of maturity. It lay on its side in a natural depression between two moss-covered boulders, and Thomas's first thought was that he'd stumbled onto someone else's kill, a lucky shot that had dropped the animal where it stood, except there was no bullet wound. Thomas knelt beside the carcass, his knees sinking into the soft earth beside the creek bank. The elk's neck was twisted at an impossible angle. The vertebrae clearly snapped with such force that he could see white bone fragments protruding through the hide. Whatever had killed this animal had done it with bare hands, or something very much like hands. The tracks around the kill site were what made Thomas reach for his cell phone. They were human-shaped, but wrong in every proportion that mattered. Each print was nearly 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, pressed deep into the soft mud beside the creek. The depth of the impressions suggested something incredibly heavy, far heavier than any human being could possibly be. But it was the spacing between the prints that really made Thomas's mouth go dry. The stride length was nearly 4 feet, suggesting something with legs far longer than any person. Thomas had grown up hearing the old stories. His grandfather had called them stick Indians, the tall ones who lived in the deep woods and sometimes took people who ventured too far from the safe places. His grandmother had called them by their Lushootseed name, a word that roughly translated to the ones who walk upright but are not people. Most of the younger folks on the reservation just called them SASQUATCH and left it at that, but Thomas had always figured the stories were just stories. Teaching tales meant to keep children from wandering too far into the forest alone. He fumbled with his phone, trying to get the camera app to work while his hands shook slightly from something that wasn't quite cold. The screen showed 2 bars of signal strength, which should have been enough to at least send a photo to his cousin Mike back in Tulalip. But when he touched the camera icon, the phone screen flickered and went black. Dead battery. Thomas stared at the dark screen for a long moment, then checked his watch. 7:45 a.m. He'd charged the phone overnight and it had shown a full battery when he'd left the cabin. These new smartphones were supposed to hold a charge for days, not hours. He pocketed the phone and stood up, every hunting instinct his grandfather had taught him suddenly screaming that he needed to get out of this drainage immediately. The elk had been dead for hours, the blood was already beginning to coagulate, and the body temperature had dropped to match the cool morning air. Whatever had killed it was long gone, except that was exactly when Thomas realized he could smell blood that wasn't coming from the dead elk. Fresh blood, still warm, still flowing. The scent was drifting down from somewhere upstream, carried on the barely perceptible breeze that was moving through the bottom of the ravine. Thomas looked back at the massive tracks pressed into the mud beside the creek and felt his stomach clench with the sudden certainty that he wasn't alone in these woods. Something was up there, something that had just made another kill, something that might have been watching him examine the dead elk. Thomas unslung his rifle and checked the chamber, the familiar mechanical click of the bolt action somehow reassuring against the growing sense that he had stumbled into a situation far beyond his understanding. The Winchester held 5 rounds of .30-06 ammunition, each bullet capable of dropping a charging grizzly bear. But looking at those impossible tracks in the mud, Thomas found himself wondering if 5 rounds would be enough. He began moving upstream, following the creek bed and trying to stay quiet despite the loose rocks and scattered deadfall that seemed determined to announce his presence to anything within a quarter mile. The blood scent grew stronger with each step until it was almost overwhelming, thick and cloying and mixed with that same wild musk he'd detected at the elk kill site. The source was another 50 yards upstream, in a small clearing where the creek made a sharp bend around a granite outcropping. At first, Thomas thought he was looking at another elk, this one a mature cow lying motionless beside a fallen log. But as he got closer, moving with the careful, measured steps his grandfather had taught him for approaching wounded animals, he realized he was looking at something far worse. The elk had been torn apart. Not by teeth or claws, but by something with the strength to literally tear a 600-pound animal into pieces. The rib cage had been ripped open, like someone opening a tin can, exposing the internal organs to the morning air. One of the hind legs had been completely severed at the hip joint and lay several feet away from the main body. The head was twisted completely around, facing backward with the eyes wide and staring. But it was the way the meat had been stripped from the bones that made Thomas's hands start shaking so badly he could barely keep his rifle steady. Whatever had done this had used tools or hands sophisticated enough to strip flesh from bone with the precision of a butcher. Long strips of muscle and fat had been peeled away from the carcass and draped over nearby bushes like some kind of grotesque decoration. It looked almost ritualistic, as if the killing itself had been only the beginning of some larger purpose. Thomas backed away from the kill site, his heart hammering against his ribs as he tried to process what he was seeing. Bears killed elk all the time in these mountains, especially in the fall when they were trying to put on weight for hibernation. Mountain lions were efficient predators that could take down animals much larger than themselves. Even wolves, though they'd been mostly eliminated from this part of Washington decades ago, could work together to bring down big game. But none of those predators would have done this. This was the work of something with human-level intelligence, but animal-level savagery. Something that killed for reasons beyond simple hunger. That was when Thomas noticed the tracks leading away from the second kill site. They headed uphill, away from the creek, following what looked like an old game trail that wound between the massive trunks of old-growth forest, the same 18-inch prints pressed deep into the soft earth and spaced with that impossible 4-foot stride. But there was something different about these tracks, something that made Thomas lean in closer, despite every instinct telling him to get as far away from this place as possible. The prints were fresh, so fresh that water was still seeping into the deepest impressions from the saturated ground. Whatever had made them was maybe 10 or 15 minutes ahead of him. Thomas stood frozen beside the creek for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds, his mind racing through options that all seemed equally terrible. He could follow the tracks and possibly encounter whatever had made them. He could head back the way he'd come and try to get to his truck, though that meant hiking nearly 2 miles through forest that suddenly felt hostile and threatening. Or he could try to call for help, though his phone was dead and the nearest ranger station was 40 miles away by the most direct route. The decision was made for him when he heard the first sound from somewhere up the hillside above him. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder or a logging truck downshifting on a steep grade. But as it continued, rising and falling in a pattern that sounded almost like vocalization, Thomas realized he was listening to something that no animal in these mountains should have been able to produce. It was almost like speech. Not human speech, but communication nonetheless, intentional vocalizations that carried meaning and purpose. The sound rose to a higher pitch, becoming something between a howl and a scream, before dropping back down to that same low rumble, and it was getting closer. Thomas looked back toward the way he'd come, calculating distances and travel time. 2 miles to the truck, most of it uphill, through forest so thick that visibility was limited to maybe 30 yards in any direction. If something was hunting him, and every instinct his grandfather had ever taught him said that was exactly what was happening, then running would only trigger its pursuit instincts. But staying put seemed even worse. He started moving, heading back downstream toward the original elk kill site, trying to balance speed with stealth. The rifle felt clumsy in his hands, the familiar weight now seeming inadequate against whatever was making those sounds behind him. Thomas had been hunting dangerous game before, black bears, the occasional aggressive cougar, but this felt different. This felt like being hunted by something that understood exactly what it was doing. The vocalizations came again, closer this time and off to his left. Whatever was making them was paralleling his route, staying in the thick timber while he followed the easier path along the creek bottom. Thomas could hear branches snapping and the heavy footfalls of something large moving through the underbrush. But every time he stopped to listen, the sounds stopped too. It was playing with him. When he reached the first kill site, Thomas made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of continuing downstream toward the main trail, he turned sharply uphill and began climbing toward a rocky outcropping he'd noticed earlier. The climb was steep and exhausting, his boots slipping on loose scree and rotting logs, but it would give him elevation and, more importantly, a clear field of fire. The sounds from the forest below changed immediately. Whatever had been paralleling his movement was now crashing through the timber with no attempt at stealth, moving fast and closing the distance between them. Thomas scrambled up the last few yards to the rocky shelf and turned to face the way he'd come, the rifle raised and ready. For nearly 5 minutes, the forest was completely silent. Thomas knelt behind a cluster of boulders, trying to control his breathing while he scanned the tree line below for any sign of movement. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, and sweat was running down his back despite the cool morning air. The rifle barrel wavered slightly as his hands shook, and he had to consciously force himself to relax his grip on the stock. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow moving between the trees, dark and indistinct in the filtered light of the forest canopy. But as it got closer, Thomas began to make out details that made his mouth go completely dry. It was walking upright, moving with a fluid, purposeful gait that was definitely bipedal but somehow wrong. Too tall, with arms that hung down past where its knees should have been. The body was covered in dark hair or fur, and even at a distance of maybe 60 yards, Thomas could tell it was massive. Not just tall, but built with the kind of muscular bulk that suggested incredible physical power. It stopped at the edge of the clearing where the first elk had been killed, and Thomas got his clearest look at something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The creature stood at least 9 feet tall, maybe 10, with shoulders broader than any human being could possibly possess. Its head was proportionally small for its body size, sitting on a neck so thick it seemed to merge directly with the massive chest and shoulders. The arms were too long, ending in hands that looked almost human, except for their size. Each finger appeared to be nearly as long as a normal person's entire hand. But it was the face that made Thomas's blood turn to ice water in his veins. It was looking directly at him. From 60 yards away, across broken terrain and through scattered timber, the creature was staring straight at the rocky outcropping where Thomas was hidden. The eyes were large and dark and unmistakably intelligent. Not the blank, instinct-driven gaze of an animal, but the focused attention of something that understood exactly what it was looking at, something that recognized him as prey. Thomas raised the rifle, trying to find the creature in his scope sight, but his hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't hold the crosshairs steady. Through the magnified view, he could see details that made the situation even more terrifying. The creature's face was a mixture of human and ape features, with a broad, flattened nose and a mouth full of teeth that were clearly designed for tearing meat. Thick brow ridges shadowed those intelligent eyes, and the entire head was covered in the same dark hair that covered the rest of its body. When Thomas blinked and looked through the scope again, the creature was gone. He swept the rifle back and forth across the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, but the forest below appeared empty. It was as if the thing had simply vanished into thin air. Thomas knew that was impossible, something that large couldn't just disappear, but he couldn't see it anywhere. That was when he heard the sound directly behind him. A low rumble, like the purring of some enormous cat, coming from somewhere among the rocks at his back. Thomas spun around, nearly losing his balance on the narrow shelf, and found himself staring at empty air. But the sound continued, seeming to come from all around him now, echoing off the granite faces of the outcropping. Thomas realized with growing horror that he'd made a terrible mistake. The creature hadn't disappeared. It had circled around behind him while he was focused on the forest below. It was somewhere above him on the outcropping, hidden among the rocks, and probably getting ready to attack. He started scrambling down from the rocky shelf, abandoning any pretense of stealth in favor of getting as much distance as possible between himself and the cliff and whatever was stalking him. Loose rocks cascaded down the slope as he half fell, half ran toward the creek bottom, the rifle clutched in both hands and his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of pursuit was immediate and terrifying. Thomas could hear the creature crashing down through the rocks behind him, moving with the kind of reckless speed that suggested it was no longer concerned with remaining hidden. The sound of its footfalls was like thunder, each impact seeming to shake the ground beneath Thomas's feet. He reached the creek bottom and turned downstream, running now with no concern for noise or concealment. His only thought was to reach the main trail and then somehow make it back to his truck before the thing caught up with him. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew closer and more violent, as if the creature was smashing through everything in its path rather than going around obstacles. Thomas's lungs were burning and his legs felt like they were made of rubber, but he kept running. The creek bed provided the clearest path through the forest, though the loose rocks and scattered deadfall made every step treacherous. Twice he nearly fell, catching himself at the last second on fallen logs or protruding roots. The sounds behind him stopped. Thomas ran another 50 yards before he realized the forest had gone completely silent again. No crashing through the timber, no heavy footfalls, no vocalizations. He slowed to a stop and turned around, the rifle raised and ready, but he couldn't see anything following him. His first thought was relief. Maybe he'd outrun it, or maybe it had given up the chase for some reason. But as the seconds stretched into minutes and the silence continued, Thomas began to feel an even deeper sense of dread. The creature hadn't given up, it had just changed tactics. Thomas started moving again, but slowly this time, trying to use the forest to his advantage. He stayed close to the creek, but used the larger trees for cover, moving from trunk to trunk and pausing frequently to listen. The silence was absolute and unnatural, as if every living thing in the forest was holding its breath. That was when he caught the scent again. Blood. Fresh and warm and so close he could almost taste the metallic tang of it in the air. But this time, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't coming from another elk kill. This time, the smell was coming from him. Thomas looked down at his arms and saw that his jacket was torn in several places, the fabric shredded as if by enormous claws. Underneath, his skin was scraped raw and bleeding from his wild scramble down the rocky outcropping. The wounds weren't serious, just surface scratches from the sharp granite, but they were bleeding freely and sending out a scent trail that would be impossible to miss. He was marking his own path for the creature to follow. Thomas pulled out his handkerchief and tried to clean the worst of the wounds, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. Every movement seemed to open the scratches wider, and the metallic scent of blood was getting stronger rather than weaker. He realized, with growing panic, that he was leaving a trail any predator could follow for miles. The attack came without warning. Thomas was kneeling beside the creek, trying to wash the blood from his arms, when something enormous crashed into him from behind. The impact drove him face first into the rocky creek bottom, and he felt, rather than heard, his rifle go skittering away across the stones. For a moment, he was completely underwater, the icy creek water filling his nose and mouth as he struggled to get his bearings. Then massive hands grabbed him by the shoulders and hauled him out of the water. Thomas found himself staring up into the face of something that should not have existed. The creature was even larger up close, its head the size of a basketball and covered in coarse, dark hair. The eyes were brown and intelligent and filled with what looked almost like curiosity. It was holding him at arm's length, studying him the way a child might examine an interesting insect. The smell was overwhelming. Not just the musky, wild scent he'd detected at the kill sites, but something deeper and more primal. It smelled like the deep forest, like rotting logs and wet earth, and something else that made Thomas's hindbrain scream with ancient terror. This was the smell of a predator, something that had been killing and eating other living things for so long that the scent of death had become part of its essence. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, they stared at each other. Thomas was too shocked to move, too overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of what was happening to process the danger he was in. The creature tilted its massive head slightly, as if trying to understand what it was looking at. Then it stood up, lifting Thomas off his feet, as if he weighed nothing at all. The creature was even taller, standing upright, at least 10 feet, with arms so long its knuckles nearly dragged on the ground. It held Thomas suspended about 3 feet off the ground, supporting his entire body weight with what appeared to be no effort at all. This close, Thomas could see that its hands were essentially human in structure, but scaled up to impossible proportions. Each finger was nearly as thick as his wrist and ended in what looked like primitive fingernails, dark and heavy and worn down from use. Thomas tried to speak, to say something that might communicate his humanity to the creature, but all that came out was a strangled whimper. The thing's grip on his shoulders was like being held in a vice, not quite tight enough to crush bones, but firm enough that Thomas knew he couldn't break free. The creature's head moved closer until Thomas could feel its breath on his face. The breath was hot and rank, smelling of decaying meat and something else that reminded him of wet dog fur. When it opened its mouth, Thomas could see teeth that were clearly designed for tearing flesh. Not the grinding molars of a herbivore, but the sharp canines and cutting premolars of something that ate meat. Then, without warning, it began to move. Still holding Thomas suspended in front of it, the creature turned and began walking deeper into the forest. Not back toward the creek or the rocky outcropping where the chase had begun, but in a completely different direction, heading uphill toward terrain Thomas had never seen before. Its gait was smooth and powerful, each step covering ground that would have taken Thomas 2 or 3 strides. Thomas tried to struggle, but the creature's grip was unbreakable. Every time he moved, those massive hands tightened slightly, as if reminding him that resistance was pointless. All he could do was hang there and watch the forest pass by as he was carried deeper into the mountains. They traveled for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The terrain grew steeper and more rugged, with granite cliffs and deep ravines that Thomas would have found difficult to navigate even with proper climbing equipment. But the creature moved through it all with easy confidence, its powerful legs carrying them both up slopes that would have been impossible for a human being to climb. The forest changed too, becoming older and wilder than anything Thomas had seen before. The trees were massive, ancient Douglas firs and western red cedars that had been growing since before European contact. Some of them were so large that it would have taken 6 or 8 people holding hands to encircle their trunks. The canopy was so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor, creating a twilight world of shadows and moss-covered logs. This was old forest, the kind of place where the original inhabitants of the Pacific Northwest had believed spirits lived, the kind of place his grandmother had warned him about in the old stories. The creature finally stopped in a small clearing beside what looked like a natural spring. Water bubbled up from between a cluster of moss-covered rocks, forming a small pool before flowing away down the hillside. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 30 yards across, and surrounded by the largest trees Thomas had ever seen. But it was what was in the clearing that made Thomas's blood turn to ice. Bones, human bones, scattered around the edges of the clearing and mixed in with the bones of elk and deer and other forest animals. Some of them were old, bleached white by years of exposure to the elements, but others were newer, still showing traces of dried tissue and sinew. Thomas could see at least 3 human skulls, one of them small enough to have belonged to a child. The creature set Thomas down at the edge of the bone field and stepped back, as if waiting to see what he would do. Thomas tried to run, but his legs wouldn't support him. The combination of shock, exhaustion, and sheer terror had left him unable to do anything but kneel there in the dirt, staring at the evidence of other people who had ended up in this place. The creature made a sound, a low, rumbling vocalization that might have been communication or might have been just animal noise. Then it turned and walked to the far side of the clearing, where it settled down beneath one of the massive trees and began to watch Thomas with those intelligent brown eyes. Thomas realized with growing horror that this wasn't a random attack. The creature had brought him here for a specific purpose. This was its killing ground, the place where it brought prey before what? The scattered bones suggested that not everyone who ended up here was killed immediately. Some had survived long enough for their bones to be picked clean by scavengers. Maybe the creature was saving him for later. Thomas forced himself to think through the situation rationally, trying to ignore the panic that was threatening to overwhelm his ability to function. He was maybe 4 or 5 miles from the nearest logging road, in terrain so rugged that even experienced hikers would have trouble navigating it. His rifle was gone, lost somewhere back at the creek when the creature had attacked him. His phone was dead, and even if it had been working, there was no cell coverage this deep in the mountains. No one knew where he was. He'd told his cousin Mike that he was going hunting, but hadn't specified which drainage or which access road he'd be using. The search and rescue teams wouldn't even start looking for him until he failed to show up for work on Monday, 3 days away. He was completely on his own. The creature continued to watch him from across the clearing, seemingly content to wait. Thomas couldn't tell if it was guarding him or just resting, but those intelligent eyes never left him for more than a few seconds. Occasionally it would shift position or make one of those low rumbling sounds, but otherwise it remained perfectly still. As the hours passed, and Thomas could tell time was passing by the slow movement of shadows across the clearing, he began to notice other details about his situation that made it even more terrifying. The bones scattered around the clearing weren't random. They'd been arranged in patterns, almost like some kind of primitive art or ritual display. Skulls were grouped together near the spring, while long bones had been sorted by size and laid out in rough circles. Whatever the creature was, it wasn't just an animal. It had intelligence, purpose, maybe even culture of some kind. The bone arrangements suggested ritual behavior, activities that went beyond simple predation into something approaching religion. Thomas was dealing with something that killed not just for food, but for reasons that might be incomprehensible to human understanding. The sun was beginning to set by the time the creature stood up and began moving around the clearing. Thomas had been sitting in the same spot for hours, afraid to move more than a few inches in any direction. His legs were cramped and his back ached, but he'd learned early that any sudden movement would cause the creature to focus its attention on him with laser-like intensity. Now it was walking around the perimeter of the clearing, occasionally stopping to examine the bone arrangements or to make those low, rumbling vocalizations. Sometimes it would pick up a skull or long bone and turn it over in its massive hands, as if considering some internal criteria Thomas couldn't understand. Then it would place the bone back in its original position and continue its circuit. Thomas realized it was preparing for something. As darkness fell, the creature's behavior became more agitated. It began pacing back and forth across the clearing, occasionally stopping to stare at Thomas with what looked like anticipation. The vocalizations became more frequent and more complex, rising and falling in patterns that definitely sounded like language, even if Thomas couldn't understand what was being communicated. Then other sounds began echoing from the forest around the clearing, answering calls coming from at least 3 different directions. The same low, rumbling vocalizations, but distinctly different voices. Thomas counted at least 4 separate sources of sound, possibly more. The creature in the clearing would call out, and the forest would answer back with a chorus of similar vocalizations. There were more of them out there. The creature that had captured Thomas was not alone. It was part of a group, a family or clan or pack, and they were gathering for something. Thomas could hear them moving through the forest, crashing through the underbrush with the same careless power that his captor had displayed. They were big, and they were coming closer. Thomas knew with absolute certainty that whatever was about to happen, he didn't want to be here when it started. He began to move, slowly and carefully, toward the edge of the clearing, farthest from where the creature was pacing. If he could make it to the tree line without being noticed, he might be able to slip away in the darkness. It was a desperate plan, with almost no chance of success, but it was better than sitting there waiting to become part of the bone collection. He made it maybe 10 yards before the creature noticed. The sound it made was unlike anything Thomas had ever heard before, a roar that seemed to combine elements of human scream, animal howl, and something else entirely. The volume was incredible, echoing off the surrounding cliffs and seeming to shake the very ground beneath Thomas's feet. Every bird in the forest, for miles around, took flight, their panicked calls adding to the cacophony. Thomas abandoned stealth and ran. He crashed into the tree line at a dead sprint, branches whipping at his face and loose rocks threatening to send him tumbling down the steep hillside. Behind him, he could hear the creature giving chase, its massive footfalls shaking the ground with each impact. But he could also hear other sounds now, more creatures crashing through the forest from different directions, converging on the clearing he'd just left. Thomas ran harder than he'd ever run in his life, his lungs burning and his heart hammering against his ribs. The forest was a maze of fallen logs and granite outcroppings, all of it invisible in the darkness beneath the thick canopy. Twice he slammed into tree trunks hard enough to nearly knock himself unconscious. Once he stepped into empty air and fell 15 feet into a hidden ravine, landing hard on his shoulder and sending shooting pains down his left arm. But he kept running. The sounds of pursuit seemed to be coming from everywhere now. Thomas could hear multiple creatures crashing through the timber behind him, their vocalizations creating a terrifying chorus that echoed through the mountains. They were coordinating their efforts, driving him in a specific direction rather than simply chasing him randomly. They were herding him. Thomas realized the truth just as the ground disappeared beneath his feet. He'd been driven toward a cliff face, a granite wall that dropped away into darkness. For a moment, he hung suspended in empty air, his arms windmilling frantically as he tried to regain his balance. Then he was falling. The impact with the rocks below drove all the air from his lungs and sent stars exploding across his vision. Thomas lay stunned at the bottom of what felt like a narrow canyon, his body a mass of pain and his head spinning from the fall. He could taste blood in his mouth and feel it running down his face from a gash on his forehead. But he was alive. Above him, he could hear the creatures at the edge of the cliff, their vocalizations now sounding frustrated rather than triumphant. Whatever they were saying to each other, it was clear they hadn't expected him to fall. They'd been trying to drive him somewhere else, and his tumble into the canyon had disrupted their plans. Thomas forced himself to sit up, ignoring the waves of dizziness and nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. He was in a narrow ravine, maybe 8 feet wide and 30 feet deep, with steep rock walls on both sides. A small stream trickled along the bottom, and he could see stars overhead through the narrow opening above. The creatures continued their vocalizations for several more minutes, then gradually fell silent. Thomas waited, hardly daring to breathe, until he was sure they'd moved on. Then he began to explore his prison. The ravine extended in both directions, following what appeared to be a natural fault in the granite. Downstream, it seemed to open up into a wider canyon. Upstream, it narrowed to barely shoulder width before disappearing into darkness. Both directions looked treacherous in the dark, but staying where he was didn't seem like an option. Thomas chose downstream and began making his way carefully along the rocky bottom. The stream provided just enough reflected starlight to show him where to place his feet, though the rocks were slippery and loose. Several times he had to crawl under fallen logs or squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for his shoulders. He traveled for what felt like hours, though it was hard to judge time in the darkness of the ravine. Gradually, the walls began to slope back, and the canyon opened up into something approaching a normal valley. The stream joined a larger creek, and Thomas could hear the sound of running water coming from somewhere ahead. When he finally climbed out of the ravine, Thomas found himself in a landscape he didn't recognize. The forest here was different, younger trees, more open understory, and the sound of a substantial stream flowing somewhere nearby. He had no idea where he was or which direction would lead him back to civilization, but for the first time since the nightmare had begun, he wasn't being actively hunted. Thomas made his way toward the sound of running water, hoping to find a creek that might eventually lead him to a logging road or hiking trail. His whole body ached from the fall and the hours of running through the forest, and the cuts on his arms and face had started bleeding again. But he was thinking clearly for the first time since the creature had first grabbed him, and he was beginning to formulate a plan. Find water, follow it downstream. Eventually, all water in these mountains led to the sound, and where there was water access, there would be roads and people and a way out of this nightmare. The creek turned out to be bigger than he'd expected, nearly 20 feet wide and flowing fast enough to create white water where it passed over rocks and fallen logs. Thomas knelt beside it and cupped his hands to drink, the cold mountain water washing the taste of blood and fear from his mouth. Then he splashed water on his face and tried to clean the worst of his wounds. In the distance, carried on the night air, he could hear vocalizations that made his blood run cold. The creatures were still out there, still hunting for him, but they sounded farther away now, and their calls seemed more dispersed, as if they'd spread out to cover a wider search area. Thomas began following the creek downstream, moving as quietly as possible and staying close to the water's edge. The sound of the flowing stream would help mask any noise he made, and the open corridor along the creek bank provided easier travel than the thick forest on either side. He walked for hours, stopping frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit, but hearing nothing except the normal night sounds of the forest. Owls called from the darkness overhead. Small animals rustled through the underbrush on both sides of the creek. Somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled its mating call, the sound echoing off the surrounding ridges. Normal sounds. The sounds of a forest that wasn't being terrorized by the presence of something that shouldn't exist. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Thomas came around a bend in the creek and saw something that made him nearly weep with relief. A logging road, cutting across the valley maybe a quarter-mile ahead. The creek passed under the road through a concrete culvert, and Thomas could see tire tracks in the dirt on both sides of the crossing. Civilization, or at least the promise of it. Thomas quickened his pace, no longer caring about noise or concealment. The road meant logging trucks, which meant radio communication with the outside world. Even if he couldn't flag down a truck, he could follow the road out of the mountains and eventually reach a highway or a town. He was going to survive this. The road was older than Thomas had hoped, more of a trail than an actual road, with grass growing up through the center and washouts that suggested it hadn't been maintained in several years. But it was definitely man-made, cutting a straight line across the valley and disappearing into the forest on both sides. Thomas could see yellow plastic markers nailed to trees along the route, the kind used by logging companies to mark cutting boundaries. He turned left, reasoning that most logging roads eventually led to highways or larger access roads. The walking was easier on the packed dirt surface, and for the first time since the nightmare began, Thomas allowed himself to believe he was going to make it out of the mountains alive. That confidence lasted exactly 43 minutes. The road ended at a massive washout where a seasonal creek had undermined the roadbed during spring runoff. The creek had carved a gully nearly 30 feet wide and 10 feet deep, completely impassable for any vehicle. On the far side, Thomas could see where the road continued, but there was no way to cross the gap. He backtracked to the main creek and turned in the other direction, hoping the road would be in better condition upstream. But after another hour of walking, he found himself at a locked gate with signs warning that the area beyond was private property and that trespassers would be prosecuted. Thomas was trapped between the washout and the locked gate, with no way forward and nowhere to go but back into the forest that was still being hunted by creatures that wanted him dead. He sat down on a fallen log beside the road and tried to think through his options. The day was getting hot, and his water supply consisted of whatever he could cup from the creek. His wounds had stopped bleeding, but were starting to show signs of infection, and his left shoulder was so stiff from the fall that he could barely move his arm. Worst of all, he could hear vocalizations in the distance again. faint but unmistakable, coming from several different directions. The creatures were still searching for him, and it was only a matter of time before they found the road and began following his trail. Thomas made a decision that probably saved his life for the second time that day. Instead of following the road in either direction, he left it entirely and began climbing straight up the ridgeline to the south. It was the most difficult route possible, requiring him to scramble up steep slopes and navigate through dense timber, but it was also the route his pursuers would least expect him to take. The climb was brutal. Thomas's legs were already shaking with exhaustion, and the steep terrain demanded every ounce of strength he had left. Several times he had to rest, clinging to tree roots and rocks while he caught his breath, but he kept climbing, driven by the knowledge that the creatures were still hunting for him somewhere in the forest below. By midday, Thomas had reached the crest of the ridge and could see for miles in every direction. To the north, he could see the valley where his nightmare had begun, a green maze of old-growth forest and granite cliffs. To the south, the mountains seemed to go on forever, ridge after ridge of unbroken wilderness stretching to the horizon. But to the west, maybe 5 or 6 miles away, Thomas could see something that made his heart leap with hope. A thin line of smoke rising from what looked like a clearing in the forest. Not the white smoke of a forest fire, but the grey smoke of a campfire or wood stove. People. Thomas began the descent toward the smoke, moving as fast as the terrain would allow. The forest on the south side of the ridge was different, younger trees, more open understory, and game trails that suggested regular use by both animals and humans. After an hour of steady hiking, he began to see other signs of human presence. A few pieces of litter left by careless campers, blazes cut into tree trunks to mark a trail, the remains of an old campfire ring. The smoke was coming from a small cabin tucked into a natural clearing beside yet another creek. Thomas could see solar panels on the roof and a satellite dish mounted on a tall pole, suggesting that whoever lived here had at least some connection to the outside world. A pickup truck was parked beside the cabin, and he could see electric lights burning in the windows despite the bright afternoon sun. Thomas approached the cabin carefully, unsure of what kind of reception he might receive. He was covered in mud and blood, his clothes were torn, and he probably looked like exactly the kind of person most rational people wouldn't want to find on their doorstep. But he was out of options and out of time. The man who answered Thomas's knock was maybe 60 years old, with grey hair and the kind of weathered face that came from spending most of a lifetime outdoors. He took one look at Thomas's condition and immediately ushered him inside, asking questions rapid fire while he helped Thomas to a chair beside the wood stove. "Jesus Christ, what happened to you? You look like you've been chewed up and spit out by a grizzly. Where's your gear? Where's your truck? How the hell did you end up way out here?" Thomas tried to explain, but the words came out in a confused jumble that made no sense even to himself. "Bears," he heard himself saying. "A bear attack. Got separated from his hunting party, lost his rifle and his pack. Been wandering in the forest for 2 days. The man's name was Bill Carruthers, and he'd been living in the mountains for the past 8 years, ever since his retirement from the Forest Service. He'd seen plenty of people who'd had bad encounters with wildlife, and he didn't ask too many questions about the details. Instead, he focused on the immediate problems, getting Thomas cleaned up, treating his wounds, and contacting the authorities. "You're lucky I was here," Bill said as he cleaned the cuts on Thomas's arms with peroxide. "I was supposed to be in Seattle this week, visiting my daughter. Changed my plans at the last minute. Good thing, too, you're in pretty rough shape." Bill's satellite phone worked, and within an hour, Thomas was talking to a dispatcher at the Clallam County Sheriff's Office. He gave them his name and a description of where he thought he'd left his truck, though he wasn't entirely sure of the exact location anymore. The dispatcher assured him that a search and rescue team would be dispatched immediately to locate his vehicle and begin searching for any other members of his party. Thomas didn't bother to explain that there hadn't been any other members of his party. Let them search. By the time they figured out he'd been alone, he'd be safely back in civilization with a story no one would ever believe. The sheriff's deputy who arrived 3 hours later was a young woman named Martinez, who seemed skeptical of Thomas's account from the beginning. She took his statement about the bear attack, but her questions made it clear she thought there were significant gaps in his story. "So you're saying you were hunting alone, despite what you told your cousin about having a partner? You left your truck at the Hoe Creek access road, but somehow ended up 15 miles away on the other side of 2 major ridgelines. You lost your rifle, your pack, your GPS, and your cell phone, but you don't have any wounds consistent with an actual bear attack." Thomas stuck to his story. Bear attack. Got disoriented, wandered in the wrong direction. Lucky to be alive. Deputy Martinez didn't believe him, but she couldn't prove he was lying. The physical evidence was consistent with someone who'd spent several days lost in the mountains, even if the details of his story didn't quite add up. She arranged for him to be transported to Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles for evaluation, and warned him that there would probably be additional questions once the search and rescue teams finished their work. The medical examination revealed exactly what Thomas had expected. Superficial cuts and scratches consistent with travel through rough terrain. Dehydration and exhaustion, no serious injuries, and no evidence of an actual animal attack. The attending physician wanted to keep him overnight for observation, but Thomas insisted on being discharged. He wanted to go home. He wanted to put as much distance as possible between himself and the mountains where something impossible lived. Thomas never went back to the mountains. The next Monday, he called his supervisor at the fishing guide service and quit, citing personal reasons. Within a month, he'd sold his cabin and moved back to the reservation full-time, taking a job with the tribal fisheries management office that kept him close to the water and far from the deep forest. He never talked about what had really happened during those 2 days in October, not to his cousin Mike, who kept asking questions about the bear attack that Thomas couldn't answer. Not to the therapist the tribal health clinic recommended when it became clear that Thomas was dealing with some kind of trauma. Not even to his grandmother, who would have understood better than anyone what he'd experienced in the deep woods. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind was blowing off the sound and carrying the scent of the mountains, Thomas would remember the smell of blood that hadn't been coming from an elk. He'd remember intelligent brown eyes studying him with predatory intent. He'd remember the sound of voices calling to each other in the darkness, coordinating a hunt for something that walked upright but wasn't quite human. And Thomas Red Sky would check the locks on his doors and windows and try not to think about the fact that somewhere in the mountains of Washington State there were things that were still looking for him. The official report filed by the Clallam County Sheriff's Office listed the incident as a hunting accident with wildlife encounter. Deputy Martinez noted several inconsistencies in the victim's account, but found no evidence of criminal activity. The case was closed without further investigation. Bill Carruthers mentioned to a few friends that he'd helped a hunter who'd had a rough encounter with a bear, but he never thought much about it until 6 months later when he found tracks around his cabin that were too large to belong to any known animal. He bought a shotgun and a better radio and started thinking seriously about moving back to civilization. The tracks Thomas had found beside the elk kills were washed away by the first heavy rain of the season. The bone field in the hidden clearing was eventually scattered by scavengers and covered by falling leaves. The old-growth forest closed ranks around its secrets, as it had been doing for thousands of years. But sometimes, late at night, hikers on the remote trails of the Olympic Peninsula report hearing sounds that don't belong to any animal listed in the field guides. Vocalizations that sound almost like speech, calling and answering from the deep woods where the really old trees grow and the shadows never quite disappear. And sometimes, just sometimes, they catch a scent on the wind that makes them think of blood and wild things and predators that hunt with intelligence rather than instinct. Most of them quicken their pace and try not to look back. A few of them leave the trail entirely and never return to the mountains. And a very few of them understand, in some primal part of their brain that remembers when humans were prey animals, that there are still places in the world where we are not at the top of the food chain. Places where something else is watching, something else is hunting, something else that knows exactly what we smell like when we're afraid. The next case. The silence that broke. A Montana encounter. Jason Reed adjusted the strap of his rifle as he stepped over a fallen log, the crunch of frost-brittle leaves echoing through the morning stillness of the Bitterroot National Forest. The October air bit at his exposed cheeks, and his breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry Montana wind. He'd been hunting these woods for 15 years, ever since moving to Hamilton from Billings, and knew every game trail, every watering hole, every spot where elk liked to bed down during the heat of the day. Something felt different this morning. Jason couldn't pinpoint what exactly had him on edge as he made his way deeper into the timber. The forest seemed too quiet, even for this early in the season. Usually the woods would be alive with the chatter of squirrels preparing for winter, the distant drumming of woodpeckers, the rustle of small animals foraging through the undergrowth. Instead, an oppressive silence hung over everything, like a heavy blanket. He paused beside a massive Douglas fir and pulled out his phone to check the time. 5:43 a.m. Plenty of time before the sun would be high enough to send the elk into their midday beds. His phone showed no signal bars, which wasn't unusual this deep in the backcountry. But the dead screen somehow made the silence feel more pronounced. The game trail he'd been following wound its way up a gentle slope toward a series of small meadows where he'd seen elk sign 2 weeks earlier. Fresh droppings, rubs on the aspen trees, tracks in the soft earth near a spring. Today should be perfect for hunting. Clear skies, light wind, temperature just cold enough to keep his scent down. So why did every instinct tell him something was wrong? Jason had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to Montana, and he'd learned to trust those instincts. They'd kept him alive when logic alone wouldn't have been enough. The same prickle between his shoulder blades that had warned him about IEDs hidden in roadside debris now told him he wasn't alone in these woods. He continued up the trail, moving slowly and deliberately, stopping every few yards to scan the timber ahead. The Remington 700 in his hands felt familiar and reassuring, though he'd only ever used it on elk and deer. He'd loaded it with 180-grain bullets that could drop a bull elk at 300 yards, more than enough firepower for anything he might encounter in these mountains. 20 minutes later, Jason reached the edge of the first meadow. He crouched behind a screen of serviceberry bushes and glassed the open area with his binoculars. Nothing moved. The meadow stretched about 200 yards across, bordered by thick stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. On the far side, he could see the dark opening where the trail continued into the next section of forest. He was about to step into the clearing when he noticed the smell. It hit him like a physical blow, a stench so powerful and alien that his stomach immediately began to churn. The odor was unlike anything he'd encountered in 15 years of hunting. It wasn't the musky smell of elk or the sharp scent of a bear's territory marking. This was something else entirely, a combination of wet fur, rotting meat, and something else he couldn't identify, something that made his primitive brain scream warnings about predators and death. Jason covered his nose with his sleeve and fought back the urge to gag. The smell seemed to be coming from the timber on the far side of the meadow, drifting across the open space on the light morning breeze. He'd heard old-timers talk about the smell that bears could produce when they were stressed or territorial, but this was beyond anything a black bear or even a grizzly could generate. He lowered his binoculars and considered his options. He could circle around the meadow, avoiding whatever was creating that horrific stench. He could head back to his truck and try a different area entirely. Or he could push forward and investigate, driven by the same curiosity that had gotten him into trouble more than once during his military service. The practical part of his mind told him to retreat. The elk would still be there tomorrow, and whatever was producing that smell was probably best left alone. But Jason had driven 2 hours from Hamilton before dawn, taken a vacation day from his job at the lumber mill, and he'd been looking forward to this hunt for weeks. Besides, the wind was in his favor, and whatever was out there probably didn't even know he was around. He checked his rifle to make sure a round was chambered, clicked off the safety, and started around the edge of the meadow. The smell grew stronger as he moved, and Jason found himself breathing through his mouth to avoid the worst of it. He stayed just inside the tree line, using the lodgepole pines for cover as he worked his way toward the source of the odor. His boots made almost no sound on the thick bed of pine needles, and he paused frequently to listen for any indication of what might be ahead. The forest remained unnaturally quiet. Halfway around the meadow, Jason found the first tracks. They were pressed deep into a patch of soft earth near a small seep where water trickled down from the rocks above. At first glance, they looked almost human. 5 distinct toes, a heel, an arch, but the proportions were all wrong. The prints were massive, at least 17 inches long and nearly 7 inches wide. The depth of the impressions suggested something incredibly heavy had made them, far heavier than any human. Jason knelt beside the clearest print and placed his hand next to it for comparison. His own foot, size 11 in hunting boots, looked like a child's beside the massive track. The toes showed distinct claw marks where they dug into the soft earth, and the overall shape was more elongated than a human foot, with a broader toe spread. He'd seen bear tracks before, both black bear and grizzly, but these were definitely not from any bear. Bears left claw marks well in front of their toe pads, and their feet had a completely different shape. These tracks looked like they'd been made by something walking upright on 2 legs, something with feet bigger than anything that should exist in these mountains. Jason pulled out his phone to take a picture, but the dead screen reminded him that his battery had died sometime during the night. He'd forgotten to charge it before leaving home, distracted by his excitement about the hunt. The camera in his pack was a cheap disposable model he'd brought as backup, and in the low light under the forest canopy, he doubted it would capture much detail. He stood and studied the tracks more carefully. There were at least 6 clear prints, forming a rough line that led from the seep toward a thick stand of timber on the opposite side of a small clearing. The stride length between prints was enormous, at least 4 feet, suggesting whatever had made them was not only massive but had long, powerful legs. The smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming. Jason fought back another wave of nausea and forced himself to follow the tracks. Each step took him deeper into unfamiliar territory, both literally and figuratively. In all his years of hunting, he'd never seen anything like these prints or encountered a smell so alien and disturbing. The tracks led him through a stand of young aspen trees, their golden leaves carpeting the ground in a thick layer that muffled his footsteps. The silence continued to oppress him, as if every living thing in the forest had fled the area. Even the ever-present buzz of insects was absent, leaving only the soft whisper of wind through the aspen leaves and the distant murmur of a creek somewhere ahead. As he moved through the trees, Jason began to notice other signs of disturbance. Branches had been broken at heights well above his head, snapped cleanly, as if something massive had pushed through without regard for the obstacles in its path. Some of the breaks were fresh, the exposed wood still showing white where the bark had been stripped away. On one large aspen, deep gouges scarred the smooth bark about 8 feet off the ground. The marks looked like claw scratches, but they were far too large and too high to have been made by any bear. Each groove was nearly an inch deep and perfectly parallel to the others, as if made by fingers rather than claws. Jason reached up to touch the lowest scratch, standing on his toes to barely reach it. Whatever had made these marks was not only tall, but possessed incredible strength. The gouges went completely through the bark and deep into the hard wood beneath, the kind of damage that would have required enormous force. A soft sound from somewhere ahead made him freeze. It was barely audible, a rustling that could have been wind through the branches or a small animal moving through the undergrowth, but something about it set his nerves on edge. The sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be random. It sounded almost like breathing, slow and deep, coming from somewhere in the thick timber ahead. Jason raised his rifle and clicked off the safety, the small metallic sound seeming incredibly loud in the oppressive silence. He waited, straining his ears for any repeat of the sound, but heard only his own heartbeat pounding in his ears and the distant murmur of moving water. Minutes passed with no further sound. Jason began to wonder if he'd imagined it, if the stress and strangeness of the morning had his mind playing tricks on him. He'd been in combat situations where the tension could make you hear things that weren't there, see movement in shadows that held nothing but darkness. He was about to lower his rifle when he heard it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound was definitely breathing, deep and slow, coming from a thick cluster of Douglas fir trees about 50 yards ahead. But the volume and rhythm were all wrong for any animal he knew. The breaths were too deep, too measured, like something very large trying to remain perfectly still while watching him. Every survival instinct Jason possessed screamed at him to retreat. He'd pushed his luck far enough for one day. Whatever was in those trees, it was big enough and strong enough to tear him apart without breaking a sweat. His rifle, while powerful enough to drop an elk, suddenly felt inadequate against something that could leave claw marks 8 feet off the ground. But he'd come too far to turn back now. The hunter in him, the same drive that had kept him going through 2 combat deployments, demanded answers. He needed to know what had made those tracks, what was producing that horrific smell, what was breathing in the darkness ahead. Jason began moving forward again, each step careful and deliberate. He kept his rifle ready, finger on the trigger, safety off. The distance to the stand of Douglas firs seemed to stretch endlessly, each yard requiring tremendous effort to cross. The breathing sounds continued, maddeningly regular, neither getting closer nor fading away. As he approached the trees, Jason could see they formed a natural screen around a small depression in the forest floor. The canopy above was so thick that very little light penetrated to the ground level, creating a pocket of deep shadow, even in the growing daylight. The smell was almost unbearable now, a wall of stench that made his eyes water and his throat burn. He was perhaps 20 yards from the trees when the breathing stopped. The sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the sound had been. Jason froze in place, rifle raised, every muscle tense with anticipation. Something was in those trees, something large and aware, and it now knew he was there. For long moments, nothing happened. Jason stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for some indication of what was watching him from the shadows. The forest around him remained as quiet as a tomb, as if even the wind had stopped moving through the branches. Then, without warning, something crashed through the timber. The sound was explosive, like a freight train plowing through the forest. Trees bent and snapped as something massive forced its way through obstacles that should have been impossible to move. Jason caught a glimpse of dark brown fur and impossible height before whatever it was disappeared into the deeper timber, moving with shocking speed despite its obvious size. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds changed everything Jason thought he knew about the world. He stood in the sudden silence, rifle still raised, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. His mind struggled to process what he'd just witnessed. The thing had been huge, far larger than any bear, moving upright on two legs with a grace that seemed impossible for something so massive. In that brief glimpse, he'd seen powerful shoulders, arms that hung nearly to the ground, and a face that was neither fully human nor entirely animal. Jason realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to exhale slowly. The rational part of his mind offered explanations: a bear rearing up on its hind legs, tricks of light and shadow, stress-induced hallucinations. But he'd gotten a good look, brief as it was, and no bear had ever moved like that or possessed those proportions. He lowered his rifle slightly and tried to calm his racing heart. Whatever he'd just encountered was gone now, crashing through the forest with sounds that grew more distant with each passing second. The smart thing to do would be to head back to his truck immediately, get out of these woods, and never speak of what he'd seen. But Jason had to know more. Against every instinct for self-preservation, he moved toward the stand of Douglas firs, where the thing had been hiding. The smell was so intense now that he had to breathe through his mouth to keep from vomiting. Each step felt like walking into a physical barrier of stench and fear. The depression behind the trees was roughly circular, about 15 feet across, surrounded by the thick trunks of the firs. The ground was bare of vegetation except for a few stunted ferns that looked sickly and yellow. But it was what covered the ground that made Jason's blood run cold. Bones, dozens of them, scattered across the forest floor like debris from some massive feast. Most were clearly from elk and deer, but there were others he couldn't identify. Some looked old, bleached white by weather and time. Others were fresh, still carrying scraps of meat and hide, the source of at least part of the horrific smell. In the center of the depression, the bones were arranged in what looked almost like a rough circle, not randomly scattered as they would be from natural predation, but deliberately placed, as if whatever lived here had some primitive understanding of organization or ritual. Jason stepped carefully around the edge of the bone pile, fighting waves of nausea from the smell and the implications of what he was seeing. This wasn't just a feeding area, this was a lair, a place where something had been living for an extended period, accumulating the remains of its kills. Near the far edge of the depression, he found more tracks. These were even clearer than the ones he'd seen earlier, pressed deep into soil that had been softened by drainage from the surrounding trees. The same massive human-like feet, but now he could see details that made his skin crawl. The feet weren't entirely human. The proportions were wrong, the toes too long and thick, the arch too pronounced. But they weren't animal feet either. They were something in between, something that suggested an intelligence that was neither fully human nor entirely beast. A sound from behind made him spin around, rifle raised. Nothing there, just the dark spaces between the trees, filled with shadows that could have hidden anything. But Jason was certain he'd heard something, a soft footfall on the thick carpet of pine needles. He was being watched. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Whatever had crashed away through the timber hadn't gone far. It was still there, somewhere in the surrounding forest, observing him as he explored its lair. Jason could feel eyes on him, studying his every movement with an intelligence that was far too advanced for any known animal. He began backing away from the depression, keeping his rifle ready, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step, a pressure between his shoulder blades that made his skin crawl. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threat, every tree trunk wide enough to conceal something massive. Jason reached the edge of the stand of Douglas firs and paused, torn between the need to retreat and the knowledge that turning his back on whatever was watching him could be a fatal mistake. The silence stretched endlessly, broken only by his own breathing and the distant sound of water moving over rocks. Then the forest exploded into chaos. The thing came from his left, from a direction he hadn't been watching, moving with impossible speed for something so large. Jason caught a glimpse of dark fur, massive shoulders, and a face that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life before the creature slammed into him like a runaway truck. The impact lifted Jason off his feet and sent him flying backward into a cluster of young aspen trees. His rifle went spinning away into the undergrowth as he crashed to the ground, his left shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. Pain exploded through his body as something in his shoulder joint tore or dislocated, sending lightning bolts of agony down his arm. For a moment, Jason lay stunned, gasping for breath and struggling to understand what had just happened. The world spun around him, trees and sky switching places in a nauseating carousel of confusion. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, the shoulder clearly damaged in the fall. Through the haze of pain and disorientation, he became aware that he was not alone. The creature stood perhaps 20 feet away, studying him with eyes that held an intelligence far beyond any animal Jason had ever encountered. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and built like a heavyweight fighter, scaled up to impossible proportions. Dark brown hair covered its entire body except for the face, hands and feet, which showed patches of dark, leathery skin. The face was the most disturbing aspect of the entire encounter. It was neither human nor ape, but something caught between the two evolutionary paths. The features were coarse and primitive, with a heavy brow ridge, flattened nose, and a mouth full of yellowed teeth that looked capable of tearing through bone. But the eyes held an awareness that no animal possessed, a consciousness that evaluated and calculated with disturbing intelligence. Jason tried to move, to reach for his rifle, or at least crawl away, but his injured shoulder sent waves of agony through his body with any attempt at movement. He was completely helpless, at the mercy of something that could tear him apart without effort. The creature took a step closer, and Jason could smell its breath, a mixture of rotting meat and something else, something that made his primitive brain scream warnings about death and predation. Up close, he could see the incredible muscle mass under the thick fur, the way its hands hung nearly to its knees, the massive chest that rose and fell with each breath. But it didn't attack. Instead, it seemed to be studying him, trying to understand what he was and why he'd invaded its territory. The intelligence in those dark eyes was unmistakable, a thinking presence that was evaluating the threat he represented and deciding what to do about it. Jason tried to speak, to make some sound that might communicate his peaceful intentions, but only a strangled croak emerged from his throat. The pain in his shoulder was making him dizzy, and he could feel consciousness beginning to slip away at the edges. The creature cocked its head slightly, the gesture eerily human-like, and took another step forward. It was close enough now that Jason could see the individual hairs on its massive hands, the way its nostrils flared as it tested his scent, the calculating look in its eyes as it decided his fate. Then, without warning, it opened its mouth and released a sound that would be burned into Jason's memory forever. The silence broke with a scream that didn't sound human or animal. It shook his chest. The vocalization was beyond anything in Jason's experience, a sound that seemed to come from some primordial nightmare. It started low, almost below the range of human hearing, then climbed to a shriek that reverberated through the forest like the wail of a banshee. The sound was so powerful that Jason could feel it in his bones, a vibration that seemed to penetrate every cell in his body. The scream went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, a declaration of dominance and territory that left no doubt about who controlled these woods. Birds that Jason hadn't even realized were there burst from the trees in panicked flight, and he was certain that every living thing within miles had heard that sound and understood its meaning. When the scream finally ended, the silence that followed was absolute. Even the sound of running water seemed to have stopped, as if the entire forest was holding its breath in the aftermath of that terrifying vocalization. The creature looked down at Jason for another long moment, its message clearly delivered. This was its territory, its domain, and Jason was an unwelcome intruder who had been allowed to live only through some alien form of mercy. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the thing turned and walked away into the timber. It didn't run or crash through the forest as it had before. It simply walked away, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Within moments, it had disappeared into the shadows between the trees, leaving Jason alone with his pain and the memory of those intelligent, calculating eyes. Jason lay on the forest floor for a long time, afraid to move, afraid to make any sound that might bring the creature back. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and he was beginning to suspect that the joint was completely dislocated. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological impact of what he'd just experienced. Everything he thought he knew about the world had just been shattered. SASQUATCH, Bigfoot, whatever people wanted to call it, was real. Not only real, but intelligent, territorial, and perfectly capable of killing any human foolish enough to invade its domain. Jason had survived the encounter, but only because the creature had chosen to let him live. As feelings slowly returned to his extremities and the immediate shock began to wear off, Jason realized he had to get out of the forest. His shoulder needed medical attention, and he needed to put as much distance as possible between himself and that thing before it decided he was a continuing threat. Moving carefully to avoid jarring his injured shoulder, Jason managed to get to his knees. The world spun sickeningly, and for a moment he thought he was going to pass out. But gradually the dizziness passed, and he was able to look around for his rifle. The Remington lay about 15 feet away, half buried under a pile of fallen aspen leaves. Jason crawled over to it, using his good arm to support his weight. Each movement sent jolts of pain through his shoulder, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to continue. When he reached the rifle, Jason was relieved to find it apparently undamaged. The scope was still aligned, and the action worked smoothly when he cycled it to check for damage. Having the weapon back in his hands made him feel slightly more secure, though he knew it would be useless against something that could move as fast as the creature he'd just encountered. Getting to his feet was an ordeal that left Jason gasping and sweating despite the cool morning air. His left arm hung useless at his side, and he had to use his rifle as a crutch to maintain his balance. But he was upright and mobile, which was more than he'd dared hope for in the moments after the attack. The question now was how to get back to his truck. Jason tried to orient himself, to figure out which direction would lead him back to the logging road where he'd parked. But the encounter had left him disoriented, and the forest all looked the same in every direction. He pulled out his compass, grateful that he'd chosen the old-fashioned magnetic type rather than relying on GPS. The needle pointed steadily north, and Jason tried to remember the route he'd taken from the road. He'd been heading generally northeast when he'd found the first tracks, then had circled around the meadow before following the creature's trail into the timber. If he headed southeast, he should eventually intersect the logging road, even if he didn't hit it at exactly the spot where he'd parked. The road ran for miles through the forest, and as long as he could reach it, he could follow it back to his truck. Jason took a last look around the site of his encounter, trying to memorize details that might be important later: the stand of Douglas firs, the bone-filled depression, the massive tracks in the soft earth. Part of him wanted to stay longer, to gather evidence, to take pictures with his disposable camera, but a larger part just wanted to get as far away as possible from this place and the thing that claimed it as its territory. He started walking southeast, moving slowly and carefully to avoid jarring his injured shoulder. Every few steps, he paused to listen for any sound that might indicate the creature was following him. But the forest remained silent, as if every living thing was still in hiding after that terrifying scream. The journey back toward the road was a nightmare of pain and paranoia. Jason's shoulder sent constant waves of agony through his body, and he found himself stopping frequently to rest and fight off dizziness. His rifle, normally light and easy to carry, felt like it weighed 100 pounds as he used it for support. Worse than the physical pain was the constant fear that he was being followed. Every rustling branch, every shadow between the trees, every small sound made him spin around in terror. The creature had let him live once, but there was no guarantee it wouldn't change its mind. Jason felt like prey, helpless and exposed, moving through territory controlled by a predator that could track and kill him whenever it chose. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Jason finally heard the sound he'd been praying for, the distant hum of a vehicle on the logging road. He angled toward the sound, pushing through a thick stand of lodgepole pines that seemed to go on forever. When he finally broke through the tree line and saw the graveled surface of the road, Jason nearly collapsed with relief. His truck was about a quarter-mile to the left, a blue Ford F-150 that looked like the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He stumbled toward it, no longer caring about the pain in his shoulder or the possibility that something might be watching from the forest behind him. The truck started immediately, a sound so normal and reassuring that Jason almost started crying. He threw it into gear and drove away from the forest as fast as the rough road would allow, not looking back until he reached the paved highway that would take him back to Hamilton. Only then did he allow himself to think about what had just happened and what he was going to do about it. Jason drove straight to the Hamilton Hospital, a small facility that served the rural communities scattered throughout the Bitterroot Valley. He told the emergency room staff that he'd fallen while hunting, dislocating his shoulder when he slipped on wet rocks. The doctor who examined him, Dr. Sarah Chen, was young and thorough, ordering x-rays that confirmed the dislocation but showed no fractures. "You're lucky, Doctor," Chen said as she reviewed the films. "Clean dislocation, no bone damage. We'll get you sedated and pop it back into place. You'll be sore for a few weeks, but there shouldn't be any permanent damage." As the nurse prepared a sedative, Jason found himself tempted to tell Dr. Chen what had really happened. She seemed intelligent and open-minded, the kind of person who might actually listen to his story, but as he opened his mouth to speak, he realized how insane it would sound. "Doctor, I was attacked by Bigfoot. It knocked me down and screamed at me, then walked away into the forest." No, that wasn't a conversation he was ready to have with anyone, especially a medical professional who would probably recommend psychiatric evaluation. The procedure to relocate his shoulder was surprisingly quick, though the pain as the joint snapped back into place was excruciating. Dr. Chen fitted him with a sling and prescribed pain medication and physical therapy. "Take it easy for a few weeks," she advised. "No heavy lifting, no strenuous activity, and maybe avoid hunting until that shoulder is completely healed." Jason nodded and promised to follow her instructions, though he was privately certain he would never go hunting again. The forest would forever be ruined for him, transformed from a place of peace and solitude into a realm of terror and unknown threats. On the drive home, Jason stopped at a gas station to buy a newspaper and use the payphone to call his supervisor at the lumber mill. He explained that he'd been injured in a hunting accident and would need to take some time off while his shoulder healed. His boss, Tom Williams, was understanding and told him to take all the time he needed. But when Tom asked what kind of accident it had been, Jason found himself sticking to the story about slipping on wet rocks. Even with someone he'd known for years, he couldn't bring himself to tell the truth. Back at his small house on the outskirts of Hamilton, Jason sat in his kitchen and tried to make sense of what had happened. He'd always been a rational man, someone who believed in evidence and logic. Even during his military service, when he'd seen things that strained credulity, he'd found ways to explain them within the framework of known reality. But this was different. This challenged everything he thought he understood about the natural world. Jason had always been skeptical of Bigfoot stories, dismissing them as hoaxes or misidentifications. When friends had shared tales they'd heard from other hunters or loggers, he'd smiled politely and changed the subject. The idea that some unknown primate could exist in the mountains of North America without being definitively documented by science had always seemed absurd. Now he knew better. The creature he'd encountered was real, physical, undeniably present. It had intelligence, territoriality, and the physical power to kill him without effort. More disturbing was the realization that it had chosen not to kill him, that his survival had been entirely at the discretion of something that operated by rules he couldn't understand. Jason tried to think about what he should do with this knowledge. Should he report it to the authorities? Should he try to gather evidence? Should he contact one of the Bigfoot research organizations he'd always dismissed as groups of deluded enthusiasts? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that no one would believe him. He had no evidence, no photographs, no physical proof of any kind. His story would be dismissed as the hallucination of an injured man, the product of shock and pain medication. At best, people would think he was confused or mistaken. At worst, they'd question his mental stability. Even if someone did believe him, what then? Would they organize expeditions to hunt the creature? Would they bring guns and cameras and tranquilizer darts to capture or kill something that had shown him mercy? The thought made Jason sick. Whatever that thing was, it had earned the right to be left alone. Over the following days, as Jason recovered from his injury and tried to return to normal life, he found that keeping the secret was almost as difficult as the encounter itself. Friends and co-workers asked about his hunting accident, and each time he had to repeat the lie about slipping on wet rocks. The deception felt like a betrayal of the most significant experience of his life. Worse were the dreams. Every night, Jason found himself back in that stand of Douglas firs, staring into those intelligent, calculating eyes. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart racing, convinced that something was watching him from the darkness outside his bedroom window. Sleep became elusive, and Jason found himself drinking more than usual to quiet the memories and fears. The pain medication helped with his shoulder, but it did nothing for the psychological trauma of the encounter. A week after the incident, Jason received a call from his friend, Mike Torres, a fellow hunter who worked for the Forest Service. Mike had heard about Jason's hunting accident and wanted to check on his recovery. "Heard you took a tumble up in the Bitterroot," Mike said. "Hope you're feeling better." "Getting there," Jason replied. "Doctor says the shoulder should be fine in a few weeks." "Good to hear. Listen, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. We've been getting some strange reports from that area lately. Hunters complaining about weird smells, unusual sounds, that kind of thing. Some of the guys think there might be a sick bear or something moving through the area." Jason's blood went cold. "What kind of reports?" "Oh, the usual nonsense. Weird tracks, trees being damaged. One guy swears he heard something screaming in the middle of the night. Probably just a bear with mange or maybe a mountain lion marking territory. But we're keeping an eye on things, maybe organizing a survey of the area." "A survey?" "Nothing major. Just a few of us going in to see if we can spot whatever's got the locals spooked. Want to make sure there's not a sick animal that might pose a threat to hikers or hunters." Jason felt a surge of panic. The thought of his friend and other Forest Service personnel blundering into the creature's territory filled him with dread. They would be armed and authorized to deal with any perceived threat, which meant the encounter would likely end with someone dead, either the humans or the creature. "Mike, maybe that's not such a good idea." "Why? You worried about us old guys getting lost in the woods?" Jason struggled to find words that wouldn't reveal what he knew. "It's just, that country can be dangerous. Lot of deadfall, steep terrain. Maybe whatever's out there will move on if you just leave it alone." Mike laughed. "Since when did you become such a conservationist? Don't worry, we know what we're doing. Probably find out it's just a bear with an attitude problem. After Mike hung up, Jason sat staring at the phone, torn between his promise to keep the creature's existence secret and his fear for his friend's safety. If he told Mike the truth, he could prevent a potentially tragic encounter, but he would also be violating the unspoken agreement he felt he'd made with the creature when it had spared his life. In the end, Jason compromised. He called Mike back and suggested that any survey of the area be conducted with extreme caution, that whatever was out there might be more dangerous than a simple sick bear. He recommended that the team go in heavily armed and avoid the area around the small meadows where Jason had been hunting. Mike seemed puzzled by Jason's sudden concern, but promised to take extra precautions during the survey. The next few days passed in an agony of waiting. Jason scoured the local newspapers for any mention of the Forest Service survey, listened to the radio for news of incidents in the Bitterroot, and called Mike several times under the pretense of checking on his recovery schedule. Finally, Mike called back with news of the survey results. "Well, we checked out that area you were so worried about," Mike said. "Didn't find much of anything. Few weird tracks that might have been from a bear. Some trees that looked like they'd been damaged by something large, but no sign of any animal, sick or otherwise." Jason felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that Mike and his team had returned safely, disappointment that they hadn't found evidence of the creature's existence. "The strangest thing," Mike continued, "was the smell in one area. Like something had died and been left to rot, but we couldn't find any carcass. Just this horrible stench coming from a grove of trees. Probably just a deer that got killed by a bear and dragged off somewhere we couldn't find it." Jason knew they'd found the creature's lair, the bone-filled depression where it had been living. But apparently the thing had moved on, abandoning its territory either because of Jason's intrusion or some other factor. The thought that it might be wandering the mountains, looking for a new place to call home, was both comforting and terrifying. As the weeks passed and Jason's shoulder healed, he found himself developing an obsession with Bigfoot research. He bought books, studied websites, read accounts from other people who claimed to have encountered similar creatures. The more he learned, the more he realized that his experience fit a pattern reported by witnesses across North America. The massive footprints, the terrible smell, the intelligent behavior, the vocalizations that defied classification, all of these elements appeared repeatedly in accounts from the Pacific Northwest, the Rocky Mountains, the deep forests of the American South. Some of the descriptions were so similar to his own experience that Jason wondered if the witnesses had encountered the same individual creature or members of the same species. But reading these accounts also reinforced his decision to keep his own encounter secret. Most of the witnesses reported being ridiculed, dismissed, or accused of hoaxing. Some had lost jobs or relationships after going public with their stories. Others had been harassed by skeptics or exploited by sensationalistic media. Jason had no desire to become another cautionary tale in the annals of cryptozoology. Instead, he chose a different path. 3 months after his encounter, Jason put his house in Hamilton up for sale and began looking for work in other parts of Montana. He told friends and family that he needed a change of scenery, that the mountains around Hamilton held too many painful memories of his hunting accident. Only the last part was true. Jason eventually found work at a lumber mill near Kalispell in the northwestern part of the state. The job paid slightly less than his previous position, but it came with the advantage of being several hundred miles away from the Bitterroot National Forest. He bought a small house near Flathead Lake and tried to build a new life away from the memories and nightmares. But even in his new home, Jason found that the encounter had changed him in fundamental ways. He no longer went hunting, despite invitations from new friends and co-workers. The thought of walking alone in the forest filled him with dread, and even hiking on well-traveled trails made him nervous and jumpy. His sleep remained troubled, filled with dreams of dark eyes watching from the shadows and screams that shook the forest to its foundations. Jason tried therapy, but found he couldn't discuss the real source of his trauma without revealing the truth about his encounter. The therapist attributed his symptoms to generic PTSD from his military service, and while the treatment helped somewhat, it never addressed the core issue. Relationships became difficult as well. Jason found himself reluctant to get close to anyone, afraid that intimacy would eventually require him to share the secret that had come to define his life. He dated occasionally, but always kept women at arm's length, unable to be completely honest about who he was and what he'd experienced. The years passed slowly. Jason aged from a man in his 30s to one approaching middle age, his hair showing grey at the temples, his face lined with stress and sleepless nights. He became known at work as reliable but solitary, someone who did his job well but kept to himself. Occasionally he would hear news from the Bitterroot area, reports of strange encounters, unusual tracks found by hikers, sounds heard in the night that couldn't be explained by known wildlife. Each time, Jason wondered if the creature was still out there, still claiming its territory, still avoiding human contact, except when some unlucky individual wandered too close to its domain. Sometimes he considered returning to the area, trying to find the creature again, perhaps attempting some form of communication or understanding. But the memory of those calculating eyes and that terrifying scream always dissuaded him. He'd been lucky once, incredibly lucky. Pressing that luck seemed like a good way to end up as another collection of bones in a hidden depression among the Douglas firs. 10 years after his encounter, Jason received word that his friend Mike Torres had died in a logging accident. At the funeral, Jason met many of his old friends from Hamilton, people he hadn't seen since moving to Kalispell. The conversation inevitably turned to hunting and the good times they'd shared in the mountains. "Remember that hunting accident you had?" asked Bill Peterson, another old friend. That was right around the time Mike was investigating those weird reports from hunters. Whatever happened with that? "Never found anything definitive," said Mike's widow, Sarah, who had overheard the conversation. "Mike always thought there might be a sick bear or mountain lion in the area, but they never found any evidence. The reports just stopped coming in after a while." Jason nodded and changed the subject, but inside he felt a familiar chill. The reports had stopped coming in because the creature had moved on, probably to some remote area where human intrusion was even less likely. It was still out there somewhere, living its life according to rules and patterns that humans couldn't understand. At the reception after the funeral, Jason found himself talking with Sarah Torres about her husband's work with the Forest Service. She mentioned that Mike had kept extensive files on unusual wildlife reports, including the investigation of the Bitterroot area where Jason had been injured. He always said there were things in those mountains that couldn't be explained by conventional wildlife biology, Sarah said. Mike was a scientist, very rational and methodical, but he admitted there were cases that didn't fit any known patterns. Jason asked if Mike had ever shared his theories about what might be responsible for the unusual reports. Sarah glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer to Jason. This might sound crazy, but Mike thought there might be an unknown primate species living in the remote areas of the Rockies. He never said it publicly, of course, because it would have been career suicide. But privately, he believed some of the reports were genuine encounters with something science hasn't classified yet. The revelation hit Jason like a physical blow. His friend had suspected the truth, had come closer to understanding the reality of what lived in those mountains than Jason had ever imagined. And Mike had taken that knowledge to his grave, just as Jason expected to do. As he drove back to Kalispell that evening, Jason wondered how many other people carried similar secrets. How many hunters, hikers, loggers, and forest workers had encountered the impossible and chosen to remain silent rather than face ridicule and disbelief. How many knew the truth but lacked the courage or the evidence to share it with the world? The thought was both comforting and tragic. Comforting because it meant Jason wasn't alone in his knowledge. Tragic because it meant that one of the most significant discoveries in natural history remained hidden by fear and skepticism. Years continued to pass. Jason reached his 50s, then his 60s, his hair now completely gray, his body showing the accumulated wear of decades of physical labor. He never married, never had children to whom he might pass on his secret. His life had been shaped entirely by a single encounter that had lasted perhaps 5 minutes on a cold October morning in the mountains of Montana. Sometimes Jason wondered if he'd made the right choice in keeping silent. Perhaps if he'd spoken up immediately after the encounter, while the memory was fresh and his injuries served as evidence of something unusual, people might have believed him. Perhaps scientific expeditions could have been organized to study the creatures rather than hunt them. Perhaps the world could have learned to coexist with something ancient and magnificent rather than driving it further into the wilderness. But those thoughts always came back to the same conclusion. The world wasn't ready for that kind of truth. Humans had proven themselves incapable of coexisting peacefully with species they did understand, let alone something as challenging to conventional beliefs as the creature Jason had encountered. Better to let it remain hidden, to preserve some small corner of the world where ancient mysteries could continue to exist without human interference. As Jason entered his 70s, his health began to decline. Years of physical labor and chronic stress had taken their toll, and he found himself facing the prospect of mortality with the knowledge that his secret would die with him. He considered writing an account of his encounter, perhaps to be published posthumously, but could never bring himself to put the experience into words that might be shared with strangers. The story remained locked in his memory, as vivid and terrifying as the day it had happened. Every detail was preserved with crystalline clarity. The smell, the tracks, the bone-filled depression, the intelligence in those dark eyes, and most of all, the scream that had broken the forest silence and changed his life forever. On a warm summer evening in his 74th year, Jason sat on the deck of his house overlooking Flathead Lake, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had once been his favorite hunting grounds. His shoulder, long since healed from the dislocation, ached with the phantom pain of memories too powerful to fade. A movement in the tree line at the edge of his property caught his attention. Jason reached for the binoculars he kept on the deck table and focused on the spot where he'd seen something move. For a moment, there was nothing but shadows and pine branches swaying in the evening breeze. Then he saw it, a massive shape standing motionless among the trees, too tall and broad to be any known animal. Even at a distance of several hundred yards, Jason could make out the distinctive proportions that had haunted his dreams for decades. The creature, for it could be nothing else, stood at the very edge of visibility, watching his house with the same calculating intelligence he remembered from that long-ago encounter. Jason lowered the binoculars, his hands shaking with a mixture of fear and wonder. When he raised them again, the tree line was empty, showing nothing but the ordinary shadows of a summer evening. But he knew what he'd seen. After all these years, after moving hundreds of miles away from the site of his original encounter, the creature had found him. Whether it was the same individual or another member of its species, Jason couldn't say. But the message was clear. He was still being watched, still remembered by something that operated according to rules beyond human understanding. Jason sat on his deck until full darkness fell, scanning the tree line for any further sign of his visitor. But the creature had delivered its message and withdrawn back into the wilderness from which it had emerged. The encounter had lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of shared secrets and unspoken understanding. As he prepared for bed that night, Jason realized that his story would indeed end as it had begun, with a creature watching from the shadows, deciding whether a human posed a threat worth eliminating. The difference was that now, at the end of his life, Jason understood that he had never been free of that original encounter. The creature had marked him in some way, claimed him as part of its territory, and would continue to watch over him until the day he died. The thought should have been terrifying, but Jason found it oddly comforting. He had spent 40 years carrying the burden of his secret alone, wondering if the world would ever accept the truth of what lived in the deep forests and remote mountains. Now he knew that acceptance was irrelevant. The creatures would continue to exist, whether humans believed in them or not, would continue to watch and judge and protect their ancient territories from a species that had forgotten how to coexist with the truly wild. Jason's last thought before sleep was of a scream that had broken the silence of a Montana forest 40 years ago, a sound that had shaken him to his bones and changed the course of his entire life. The silence broke with a scream that didn't sound human or animal. It shook his chest. Even now, after all these years, he could feel the vibration of that call echoing through his body, a reminder that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. Some territories were not meant to be claimed by human ambition. The creatures would endure long after Jason Reed was gone, long after the last human had forgotten the old stories of things that lived in the shadows between known and unknown. They would continue to watch from their hidden places, ancient guardians of secrets that the modern world was not ready to understand, and perhaps that was exactly as it should be. Outside his bedroom window, something moved among the trees that bordered Flathead Lake, a shadow larger than any known animal, watching over the house where an old man slept with dreams full of dark eyes and terrible screams. The creature observed for a moment longer, then melted back into the wilderness like morning mist, leaving no trace of its presence except for the faint impression of massive feet in the soft earth and the lingering sense that something ancient and unknowable had passed through the night. The forest kept its secrets, as it always had and always would. And in the mountains of Montana, where the modern world met the edges of something far older and more mysterious, the Watchers continued their eternal vigil, guardians of boundaries that most humans never even suspected existed. Jason Reed's encounter would remain his secret until the day he died, taking with him to the grave the memory of intelligent eyes and a scream that had shaken the very foundations of his understanding of the natural world. But the creatures would remember him as well, would carry forward their own memories of the human who had stumbled into their domain and lived to tell no one about it. In the end, that mutual silence was perhaps the most profound form of communication possible between two species, separated by millions of years of evolution, but connected by a single moment of recognition in a Montana forest where the impossible had revealed itself to be terrifyingly, magnificently real. The story ended, as all such stories must, with questions unanswered and mysteries preserved, with the wild places of the earth keeping their secrets safe from a civilization that had forgotten how to listen to the voices of the truly unknown. And somewhere in the deep forests and remote mountains, ancient eyes continued to watch and wait, patient as stone, eternal as the wilderness itself. The next case. The blind Robert Green had been hunting these Georgia woods for 37 years, and he'd never felt watched before. Not like this, not with the hair on his neck standing up like a scared cat's while he sat perfectly still in his elevated blind, 20 feet off the ground in the thick canopy of sweet gum and oak trees that bordered the Chattahoochee National Forest. The morning had started normal enough. His alarm went off at 4:30 in his motel room in Blue Ridge, same as it had for the past 4 days of his annual hunting trip. black coffee from the machine in the lobby, protein bar from his pack, and the 40-minute drive on increasingly narrow dirt roads until he reached the spot where he'd been seeing deer sign all week. Big tracks in the mud, fresh scrapes on tree bark, scat that wasn't more than a day old. This was supposed to be the morning he finally got his shot at the 10-point buck he'd been tracking. Robert climbed the aluminum ladder to his portable blind in the pre-dawn darkness, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times. The blind was a simple box affair, camouflaged canvas stretched over a lightweight frame with narrow slots cut for observation and shooting. He'd positioned it overlooking a natural clearing where 3 deer trails converged near a small creek. Perfect setup. Perfect location. Everything was perfect except for the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. It started with the silence. Robert had been sitting motionless for 2 hours as the sun crept above the tree line, and he hadn't heard a single bird call. No squirrels chattering in the branches, no rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Even the ever-present buzz of insects had faded to nothing. The forest felt empty, as if every living thing had simply vanished or was holding its breath. Robert shifted slightly in his portable chair, the smallest movement causing the aluminum frame of the blind to creak softly. He'd hunted in quiet woods before, but this was different. This was the kind of silence that made his ears ring, that made him strain to hear something, anything, to prove he hadn't gone deaf. The only sound was the distant whisper of water moving over rocks in the creek below, and even that seemed muffled, as if the air itself had grown thick. His rifle lay across his lap, a .3006 that had dropped more deer than he could count. The familiar weight of it should have been comforting, but instead it felt inadequate. Robert couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer the predator in this scenario. Something had shifted in the natural order, and he found himself glancing nervously through the observation slots, scanning the tree line for movement that never came. The first real sign that something was wrong came at 8:15. Robert was watching a spot where the main deer trail emerged from a thicket of mountain laurel when he caught a flash of movement in his peripheral vision. Something large had moved between 2 trees about 60 yards to his left. Too big to be a deer, too fluid to be human. When he turned his head to look directly at the spot, nothing was there. Just trees and shadows and the growing certainty that he was being observed. Robert forced himself to remain still. Maybe it had been a bear. Black bears were common in these mountains, and while they generally avoided humans, they weren't unheard of. But the movement hadn't looked like a bear. It had been upright, moving on 2 legs, with a stride that seemed too long, too purposeful. Bears could walk upright, but they didn't prefer it, and they certainly didn't move with that kind of fluid grace. 20 minutes later, it happened again. This time he was ready for it, keeping his peripheral vision active while pretending to focus on the clearing below. Something definitely moved between the trees, roughly parallel to his position, but keeping well back in the shadows. Robert tried to track it, turning his head slowly, but whatever it was, had a talent for staying just out of direct sight. Every time he thought he had a bead on it, it would shift position, always seeming to know exactly where he was looking. The smell hit him around 9 o'clock. It started as a faint, musky odor that he initially dismissed as decomposing leaves or maybe a dead animal somewhere downwind, but it grew stronger over the next few minutes, developing into something that made his sinuses burn and his eyes water. It wasn't like any animal smell he'd encountered. There was a wild, unwashed quality to it, mixed with something organic and rotting that made his stomach churn. The scent was so strong it seemed to coat the inside of his mouth, leaving a taste like copper pennies and old meat. Robert tried breathing through his mouth, but that only made it worse. The smell was coming from somewhere close, maybe within 50 yards of his position. He scanned the area methodically, looking for the source, but saw nothing unusual. just trees and undergrowth and the same empty clearing he'd been watching all morning. Whatever was making that smell was either very good at hiding or was positioned somewhere he couldn't see from his elevated vantage point. That's when he heard the first vocalization. It started low, almost below the range of human hearing, a rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. Robert felt it more than heard it, a vibration that traveled up through the tree trunk and into the platform of his blind. The sound built slowly, rising in pitch and volume until it became a series of deep, guttural calls that echoed through the forest like nothing Robert had ever heard. It wasn't a bear. Bears could make some impressive sounds, but nothing like this. It wasn't a mountain lion either, though they could produce sounds that would turn a grown man's blood cold. This was something else entirely, something that made every instinct Robert possessed scream at him to climb down from his blind and get back to his truck as fast as his legs could carry him. Instead, he stayed put. Robert Greene had served 2 tours in Vietnam before returning to Georgia to work construction for 40 years. He'd faced down armed men, dangerous machinery, and natural disasters that had sent other people running. He wasn't about to be spooked by strange sounds in the woods, no matter how unsettling they might be. This was probably just some hunter's idea of a prank, maybe using an electronic call to try to scare him away from prime hunting grounds. The vocalizations continued for several minutes, seeming to move in a rough circle around Robert's position. Sometimes they came from his left, sometimes from directly behind him, occasionally from the right. Whatever was making the sounds was definitely mobile, and it seemed to be establishing some kind of perimeter around his blind. The calls themselves varied in tone and length, ranging from low rumbles that he felt in his chest to higher-pitched whoops that made the hair on his arms stand up. Robert tried to rationalize what he was hearing. Maybe it was a group of hunters using predator calls, trying to drive game in his direction. Or maybe someone was testing new hunting equipment, some kind of electronic game caller that produced sounds he wasn't familiar with. But even as he formed these explanations in his mind, he knew they didn't fit. The sounds were too organic, too varied, too precisely modulated to be coming from any kind of device. And they were definitely being produced by a single source, not multiple hunters spread out through the woods. By 10 o'clock, Robert's hands were shaking slightly, and he found himself gripping his rifle tighter than necessary. The vocalizations had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was somehow worse. He felt exposed in his blind, like a target rather than a hunter. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threat. Every rustle of wind through the leaves made him tense for action he couldn't name. That's when he saw the tree movement. About 40 yards away, a medium-sized oak tree began to sway back and forth, its trunk flexing like it was caught in a strong wind. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still, so motionless that Robert could see individual gnats hanging suspended in shafts of sunlight. The tree continued to move for nearly a minute, its entire structure rocking rhythmically before coming to an abrupt stop. Robert stared at the spot through his rifle scope, trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed. Trees didn't just start moving by themselves. Something had to be pushing it. Something strong enough to flex a trunk that was probably 8 inches in diameter. He'd seen bears rub against trees, but not with enough force to make them sway like that. And whatever had moved the tree was no longer visible, having apparently melted back into the forest as soon as the movement stopped. A new smell reached his blind, different from the musky odor he'd been breathing for the past hour. This one was sharper, more acrid, like the scent that comes from an animal marking its territory. Robert had smelled something similar when tracking territorial bucks during rutting season, but this was stronger, more concentrated, and it carried an undertone of aggression that made his pulse quicken. The scent seemed to be coming from multiple directions now, as if whatever was out there had been methodically marking trees in a circle around his position. Robert began to feel like prey, like something that had wandered into another predator's territory and was being evaluated for threat level. The rational part of his mind kept insisting that this was all perfectly explainable, that there was some logical reason for everything he was experiencing. But the primitive part of his brain, the part that had kept his ancestors alive in hostile wilderness, was screaming warnings that he found harder and harder to ignore. At 10:30, Robert finally saw it clearly. The creature emerged from behind a cluster of pine trees about 70 yards away, moving with a fluid gait that was definitely bipedal, but unlike anything human. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall and covered in dark brown fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The creature's shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms long enough that its hands nearly reached its knees, and its head sat forward on its neck in a way that suggested tremendous physical power. Robert froze, hardly daring to breathe as the creature paused at the edge of the clearing. It turned its head slowly from side to side, clearly scanning the area, and Robert got his first clear look at its face. The features were ape-like but alien, with a flat nose, pronounced brow ridge, and eyes that seemed to glow with reflected light even in the morning sun. When those eyes turned in his direction, Robert felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The creature was looking directly at his blind, not scanning the area randomly, not searching for the source of some sound or scent. It was staring right at Robert's position with the focused attention of something that knew exactly where he was and was deciding what to do about it. Robert remained motionless, hoping against hope that the camouflage canvas of his blind would be enough to hide him. But the creature's gaze never wavered. For nearly 5 minutes, they watched each other in absolute silence. Robert could see the creature's chest rising and falling with its breathing, could make out the texture of its fur, and the way its massive hands flexed occasionally at its sides. The thing's presence seemed to fill the entire clearing, dominating the space with an authority that made Robert feel like an intruder in his own hunting grounds. Then, without warning, the creature let out a vocalization that made every previous sound seem like a whisper. The call started as a low rumble, but quickly built to a roar that seemed to shake the very air around Robert's blind. It was a sound of pure aggression, a challenge that needed no translation. The creature was making it clear that Robert was trespassing, that his presence was not welcome, and that continued occupation of this territory would have consequences. Robert's finger found the safety on his rifle, clicking it off with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the aftermath of the creature's roar. His hands were shaking now, but not from fear. Adrenaline was flooding his system, sharpening his focus and steadying his grip on the weapon. If this thing wanted a confrontation, Robert was prepared to give it one. The creature took a step forward, then another, moving with deliberate slowness across the clearing. Each footstep landed with enough force to be audible from Robert's position, the sound of something that weighed far more than any human. As it moved closer, Robert could make out more details. The creature's hands were enormous, with fingers that looked capable of crushing bone. Its gait was slightly bow-legged, giving it a rolling motion that somehow suggested both power and agility. At 50 yards, the creature stopped again and tilted its head, studying Robert's blind with what looked like curious intelligence. Robert could see its nostrils flaring as it tested the air, probably picking up his scent, despite his careful use of scent-blocking sprays. The thing's eyes never left his position, and Robert began to realize that his elevated blind, which had seemed like such an advantage this morning, might actually be a trap. He was 20 feet off the ground with only one way down, and that way led directly past the creature that was now blocking his exit route. The second creature appeared without warning, emerging from the trees to Robert's right. This one was slightly smaller than the first, but moved with the same fluid grace, the same purposeful stride. Robert's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized he was now facing two of these things, both positioned to cut off any escape route he might attempt. The smaller creature took up a position about 30 yards from the first, and they began to communicate in a series of low vocalizations that sounded almost conversational. Robert had never felt so alone in his life. His cell phone was in his jacket pocket, but he was deep enough in the mountains that service was spotty at best. Even if he could get a signal, who would he call? The local sheriff's department. They'd think he was drunk or having some kind of breakdown. Park rangers? They might take him seriously, but by the time they arrived, whatever was happening here would be long over. The larger creature began moving again, this time angling directly toward the tree that supported Robert's blind. With each step, it grew larger in Robert's scope, more imposing, more obviously dangerous. Robert could see the muscles moving under its fur, could make out the way its lips pulled back slightly to reveal teeth that looked designed for tearing rather than chewing. When it reached the base of his tree, the creature placed one massive hand against the trunk and looked up directly at him. Robert found himself staring into eyes that held an intelligence he hadn't expected. These weren't the blank, instinct-driven eyes of a wild animal. There was thought behind them, calculation, and something that might have been amusement. The creature was evaluating him, deciding whether he represented a threat worth eliminating or merely an annoyance to be dealt with. The tree began to shake. The creature was pushing against the trunk with enough force to make the entire structure sway, causing Robert's blind to rock back and forth like a boat in rough water. Robert gripped the sides of his chair, trying to maintain his balance as the movement grew more violent. The creature wasn't just testing the stability of the tree, it was demonstrating its power, showing Robert exactly how precarious his position had become. Robert made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of trying to climb down and surrender the territory to these creatures, instead of firing a warning shot into the air to try to scare them off, he aimed his rifle directly at the larger creature's center of mass and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the forest like thunder, and for a split second, Robert thought he might have solved his problem. But the bullet struck the ground 3 feet to the left of the creature, kicking up a spray of dirt and dead leaves. In his nervousness, his usually steady aim had failed him completely. The creature barely flinched at the sound of the gunshot, but its reaction to the near miss was immediate and terrifying. The thing's lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed teeth Robert could see clearly, even from 20 feet above. Its massive chest swelled as it drew in a breath, and then it released a roar that seemed to come from the deepest parts of hell. The sound was so loud, so filled with rage, that Robert felt it as a physical force hitting his body. Birds exploded from trees hundreds of yards away, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of other animals crashing through the underbrush as they fled. Robert had made the creature angry, very, very angry. The thing began to climb. Not with the careful, methodical movements of a human ascending a tree, but with the fluid, powerful motions of something that had been climbing trees since birth. Its massive hands found purchase on the rough bark, and it pulled itself upward with an ease that made Robert's blood run cold. Each movement was precise and controlled, bringing the creature closer to his blind with terrifying efficiency. Robert worked the bolt on his rifle, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. His hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely operate the mechanism, but somehow he managed to get another bullet into the chamber. The creature was halfway up the tree, close enough that Robert could see the individual hairs on its massive forearms, could smell its musky odor even more strongly than before. He fired again, this time aiming for the creature's head. Once again, his shot went wide, splintering bark from the tree trunk but doing no damage to his target. The creature didn't even pause in its ascent. If anything, the second missed shot seemed to increase its determination to reach Robert's position. It climbed faster now, its powerful arms pulling it up the trunk with mechanical precision. Robert tried to chamber another round, but his hands were shaking so badly that he fumbled the bolt action. The spent casing jammed halfway out of the ejection port, and suddenly his rifle was useless. He looked around desperately for another option, but there was nowhere to go. The creature was less than 10 feet below him now, close enough that he could hear its breathing, could see the way its muscles bunched and released with each movement. That's when the thing reached the platform of his blind and began tearing it apart. The creature's massive hands gripped the edge of the wooden platform and began to pull. Robert heard the sound of nails being torn from wood, the sharp crack of lumber beginning to fail under stress. It was never designed to handle. The entire structure of his blind began to shake as the creature methodically destroyed the supports that kept Robert 20 feet above the ground. Robert abandoned his jammed rifle and grabbed for the aluminum ladder that led down from his blind. It was his only escape route, but reaching it meant getting past the creature that was systematically dismantling his platform. As he leaned toward the ladder, one of the support beams gave way with a sharp crack, and suddenly the entire blind tilted at a dangerous angle. The creature's hand shot through one of the observation slots, its massive fingers grasping for Robert. He threw himself backward, feeling the tips of those fingers brush against his jacket. The canvas wall of the blind tore like paper under the creature's strength, opening a gash large enough for Robert to see its face clearly for the first time. The thing's eyes were filled with an intelligence that was somehow worse than mindless animal rage. It knew exactly what it was doing, and it was enjoying Robert's terror. Robert grabbed his hunting knife from his belt, a 6-inch blade that suddenly seemed pathetically small. The creature's arm came through the torn canvas again, this time gripping the aluminum frame of his chair. Robert slashed at the massive hand with his knife, feeling the blade connect with something that felt like leather stretched over steel cables. The creature jerked its hand back with a sound that might have been surprise or amusement, and Robert saw a thin line of dark blood across its knuckles. The sight of that blood seemed to transform the creature's demeanor entirely. What had been methodical destruction became frenzied violence. Both hands came through the walls of the blind now, tearing at the canvas and aluminum frame with enough force to send pieces flying in all directions. Robert found himself in the middle of a whirlwind of destruction, trying to avoid the massive hands that seemed to be everywhere at once. The platform gave way completely. Robert felt the sickening sensation of falling, 20 feet of empty air between him and the ground below. He hit the earth hard, his left shoulder taking most of the impact and sending a bolt of fire through his entire arm. His knife flew from his hand, disappearing into the undergrowth, and for a moment he lay stunned among the wreckage of his blind. Above him, the creature let out another roar, this one containing what sounded like satisfaction. Robert rolled onto his stomach and tried to push himself up with his good arm, but his shoulder was definitely injured, possibly dislocated. Every movement sent waves of agony through his body, and he could feel something warm running down his arm that was probably blood. The creature dropped from the tree with a thud that Robert felt through the ground. It landed in a crouch less than 10 feet away, its massive form blocking out most of the morning sunlight. Robert found himself looking up at something that belonged in nightmares, not in the familiar woods where he'd hunted for most of his adult life. The thing's chest was heaving with exertion or excitement, and its eyes were fixed on Robert with an intensity that made him feel like a mouse being studied by a particularly intelligent cat. Robert tried to crawl away, using his good arm to pull himself across the forest floor. His left side was largely useless now, his shoulder grinding with each movement, but sheer terror gave him the strength to keep moving. Behind him, he could hear the creature following, its footsteps deliberate and unhurried. It wasn't chasing him, it was stalking him, taking its time to savor his helplessness. A fallen log blocked Robert's path, too high for him to crawl over in his injured condition. He tried to go around it, but the creature was suddenly there, placing one massive foot on the log directly in front of him. Robert looked up into a face that was only inches away, close enough to see the individual hairs around its nostrils, close enough to smell its breath, which carried the metallic scent of blood and something else that made his gorge rise. The creature reached down with one hand, and Robert was certain this was the end. But instead of crushing his skull or tearing him apart, the thing simply placed its palm against his forehead and pushed, not hard enough to cause serious injury, but firmly enough to pin him against the ground. The gesture was unmistakably possessive, like a predator marking its prey. For nearly a minute, they stayed in that position. Robert flat on his back with a massive hand holding him down, the creature crouched over him like some primitive god accepting a sacrifice. Robert could feel the creature's pulse through its palm, could sense the incredible strength being held in check. This thing could have killed him instantly, but it was choosing not to. The question was why. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the encounter was over. The creature removed its hand and stepped back, studying Robert with those intelligent eyes for a few more seconds. Then it turned and walked away, not hurriedly, not furtively, but with the confident stride of something that owned these woods and everything in them. Within moments, it had disappeared into the forest as silently as it had appeared. Robert lay on the ground for a long time after the creature was gone, partly from shock and partly from the pain in his shoulder. His entire body was shaking with reaction, and he found himself fighting waves of nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. When he finally managed to sit up, the clearing looked like a war zone. Pieces of his blind were scattered everywhere, the aluminum frame twisted into impossible shapes, the canvas torn to shreds. His rifle lay nearby, the bolt action still jammed with the spent casing. Robert tried to work it free with his good hand, but gave up after a few attempts. The weapon was probably ruined anyway, and even if it wasn't, he had the feeling that bullets wouldn't have made much difference against something like that creature. Getting back to his truck took Robert nearly 2 hours. His shoulder was definitely dislocated and possibly broken as well, making it impossible to use his left arm. He had to navigate by memory through woods that suddenly seemed alien and hostile, jumping at every sound, constantly looking over his shoulder for signs of pursuit. Several times he was certain he caught glimpses of something large moving parallel to his path, but he never got a clear look at it. The creature was following him. Robert was sure of it. Not threateningly, not with any apparent intent to attack, but it was definitely there, keeping pace with his slow progress through the forest. Sometimes he thought he could hear its breathing. Sometimes he caught a whiff of that distinctive musky odor. The thing was escorting him out of its territory, making sure he actually left. Robert's truck was exactly where he'd left it, parked on a dirt road that looked like a highway compared to the wilderness he'd just escaped. His keys were in his right pants pocket, thankfully, because his left arm was completely useless. Starting the engine with one hand was awkward, but manageable. As he put the truck in gear, Robert caught a glimpse of movement in his rear-view mirror. Something large stood at the edge of the tree line, watching his departure. The drive back to Blue Ridge was a blur of pain and shock. Robert's shoulder was swelling badly now, and dark bruises were beginning to show through tears in his jacket. He needed medical attention, but first he needed to decide what he was going to tell people. The truth was impossible. No one would believe him. But he couldn't just ignore what had happened, couldn't pretend that his injuries were the result of a simple hunting accident. The emergency room at Union General Hospital was nearly empty on a Wednesday morning. Robert told the triage nurse that he'd fallen from his tree stand, which was technically true, even if it didn't explain how his hunting blind had been torn apart by something with superhuman strength. The attending physician, a young woman who looked barely old enough to have finished medical school, examined his shoulder with professional thoroughness. "Separated shoulder," she announced after studying his x-rays. "Clean dislocation, no fractures. You're lucky. Falls from hunting stands can be a lot worse than this." She paused, studying the pattern of scratches on his arm. "These look like claw marks. Did you encounter an animal after you fell?" Robert nodded, grateful for an explanation that was both true and believable. Something ran off after I hit the ground. Didn't get a good look at it. Probably a bear. They're active this time of year, getting ready for winter. You might want to consider getting a rabies series just to be safe. Robert declined the rabies shots, but accepted the prescription for pain medication and the referral to an orthopedic specialist. His shoulder was properly reduced and immobilized in a sling, and he was given instructions to follow up in a week. The entire medical encounter took less than 2 hours, and through it all, Robert said nothing about what had really happened in those woods. The motel room felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of the morning. Robert sat on the edge of the bed, his injured arm supported by the sling, and tried to make sense of what he'd experienced. He'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that lived in the space between reality and legend. The rational part of his mind kept trying to find alternative explanations, but the evidence was too compelling to ignore. His hunting blind had been destroyed by something with incredible strength. He'd been physically dominated by a creature that could have killed him without effort, but had chosen not to. Most importantly, he'd looked into eyes that held an intelligence he couldn't dismiss or rationalize away. Whatever that thing had been, it wasn't just an animal. Robert tried calling his wife, but the conversation didn't go well. Sarah could hear the stress in his voice, could tell that something had happened beyond a simple hunting accident. But when she pressed him for details, he found himself unable to explain. How could he tell the woman he'd been married to for 32 years that he'd encountered something that wasn't supposed to exist? "I'm coming home early," Robert told her finally. "Trip's not working out like I hoped." "Are you sure you're okay to drive with that shoulder?" "I'll manage. Should be home by tomorrow evening." After hanging up, Robert sat in the silence of the motel room and tried to decide what to do next. Part of him wanted to contact the local authorities to report what he'd seen in case there were other incidents. But he knew how that conversation would go. At best, they'd think he was confused or traumatized. At worst, they'd assume he was lying or mentally unstable. The Georgia Department of Natural Resources had a website where people could report wildlife encounters. Robert spent an hour crafting a carefully worded report that described his experience in vague terms, mentioning unusual vocalizations, signs of large wildlife, and an encounter with an unidentified animal. He submitted the report electronically, knowing it would probably be filed away and forgotten, but feeling obligated to create some kind of official record. That night, Robert barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that massive face staring down at him, felt that enormous hand pressing against his forehead. The motel's air conditioning unit cycled on and off throughout the night, but Robert found himself listening for sounds that didn't belong, half expecting to hear those deep vocalizations outside his window. The drive back to his home in Macon took most of the following day, with frequent stops to rest his shoulder and stretch his legs. Robert found himself constantly checking his rearview mirror, though he couldn't say what he expected to see. The rational part of his mind knew that he was hundreds of miles from those woods now, but the primitive part of his brain insisted that he was still being watched. Sarah took one look at him when he walked through the front door and knew that something fundamental had changed. It wasn't just the obvious injuries or the way he carried himself with his arm in a sling. Something in his eyes was different, a wariness that hadn't been there when he'd left for his hunting trip 4 days earlier. "What really happened up there?" she asked as she helped him settle into his recliner. Robert considered telling her everything. Sarah was a practical woman, a retired nurse who'd seen enough strange things in her career to keep an open mind. But even as he formed the words in his mind, he knew how insane they would sound. Instead, he stuck to the story he'd crafted for the medical personnel. Tree stand collapsed, had a run-in with a bear afterward. Nothing I couldn't handle. but it shook me up more than I expected. Sarah studied his face with the keen attention of someone who'd been married to him for 3 decades. She knew he was holding something back, but she also knew her husband well enough to recognize when pushing for details would be counterproductive. "Well, your home's safe now." That's what matters, but Robert didn't feel safe. Over the following weeks, as his shoulder healed and he returned to his normal routine, he found himself jumping at unexpected sounds, checking locks obsessively, and avoiding windows after dark. He'd always been a sound sleeper, but now he lay awake for hours listening to the normal sounds of his suburban neighborhood and wondering if anything was moving in the shadows between streetlights. His appetite disappeared almost entirely. Food had no taste, and the act of eating reminded him uncomfortably of those massive teeth he'd seen, designed for tearing rather than chewing. He lost 15 pounds in the first month after his return, prompting Sarah to schedule an appointment with their family physician. Dr. Martinez had been Robert's doctor for over a decade, and he recognized the signs of post-traumatic stress immediately. The weight loss, the insomnia, the hypervigilance, they all pointed to someone who'd experienced something traumatic and was struggling to process it. Sometimes, encounters with large wildlife can be more psychologically impactful than we expect, Dr. Martinez explained during Robert's appointment. Bears, in particular, can trigger very primitive fear responses. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Robert accepted the prescription for sleeping pills and the referral to a therapist, but he never made the appointment. How could he explain to a mental health professional that he was afraid to go into his own backyard after dark because he was worried about being watched by something that wasn't supposed to exist? The worst part was the doubt. As weeks turned to months, Robert began to question his own memories of that morning in the woods. Had the creature really been as large as he remembered? Had its eyes really held that kind of intelligence? The human mind was remarkably good at filling in gaps and embellishing memories, especially under stress. Maybe he'd encountered a large bear, and his frightened mind had transformed it into something more monstrous. But then he would remember the sound of his blind being torn apart, the casual way those massive hands had ripped through aluminum and wood. He would recall the deliberate way the creature had stalked him after he fell, not hurried or instinct-driven, but calculated and controlled. Most of all, he would remember the weight of that hand on his forehead, the unmistakable sense of being evaluated by something that understood exactly what it was doing. Robert stopped hunting entirely. His collection of rifles and shotguns, accumulated over 40 years of pursuing game throughout the southeast, gathered dust in their locked cabinet. Sarah suggested that maybe it was time to find a new hobby, something less dangerous, but Robert couldn't explain that the danger wasn't what bothered him. It was the helplessness, the realization that all his weapons and experience had meant nothing when confronted with something genuinely threatening. He tried to return to his normal life, but normal had been fundamentally altered by those few hours in the Georgia mountains. Robert went through the motions of his daily routine, but part of him remained in that clearing, pinned beneath a massive hand, while intelligent eyes studied him like a specimen. He'd been marked by the encounter in ways that went beyond the physical injuries to his shoulder. The scratches on his arm healed within a few weeks, but they left faint scars that Robert found himself touching obsessively. The marks were proof that something had happened, evidence that his memories weren't entirely the product of trauma and imagination. When doubt crept in, when the rational part of his mind tried to convince him that he'd simply had a close encounter with a confused black bear, he would run his fingers over those scars and remember the intelligence in those eyes. 6 months after the incident, Robert finally contacted a researcher at the University of Georgia who studied wildlife behavior in the Appalachian Mountains. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was a respected primatologist who'd spent decades documenting the behavior of great apes in Africa before returning to her home state to study native wildlife. Robert had found her name on the university website and spent weeks working up the courage to make the call. "I had an encounter with something unusual," Robert began carefully after explaining that he was an experienced hunter. "I'm not sure how to classify it." Dr. Walsh was patient and professional, asking detailed questions about the location, time of day, weather conditions, and specific behaviors Robert had observed. She never made him feel foolish or delusional, even when he described vocalizations and behaviors that didn't match any known North American wildlife. "There have been similar reports from that region, Doctor," Walsh said finally. "Nothing conclusive, of course, but enough to suggest that there might be an unidentified species of large primate in the southern Appalachians. Your description is remarkably consistent with other accounts I've collected." Robert felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost overwhelming. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't the only person who'd encountered something like this. Whatever he'd faced in those woods, it was real enough that a respected scientist was taking it seriously. "What should I do with this information?" Robert asked. "Document everything you can remember, locations, times, specific behaviors. If you're willing, I'd like to include your account in a paper I'm preparing on unidentified primate sightings in the region. Your experience as a hunter gives your observations more credibility than most." Robert agreed to participate in Dr. Walsh's research, and over the following months, he provided detailed written accounts of his encounter. The process of documenting everything helped him organize his memories and identify details he hadn't consciously noticed at the time. The way the creature's gait had suggested an adaptation to rough terrain, the precise way it had tested the air for scents, the calculated manner in which it had demonstrated its strength before escalating to direct confrontation. Dr. Walsh's paper was eventually published in a wildlife behavior journal, though Robert's account was anonymized to protect his privacy. The publication didn't prove anything definitive, but it added Robert's experience to a growing body of evidence suggesting that something unusual was living in the remote forests of North America. For Robert, the validation was important, but it didn't eliminate the lasting effects of his encounter. He never returned to those Georgia woods, never again felt comfortable in any forest where the trees were thick enough to hide something large. His hunting days were over, not because he'd lost interest in the sport, but because he'd learned that he wasn't always the apex predator he'd assumed himself to be. Sarah noticed the changes in her husband, but chose not to press him for details he wasn't ready to share. She could see that whatever had happened during his final hunting trip had fundamentally altered his relationship with the outdoors. Robert, who'd once spent every available weekend in the woods, now preferred to stay home or visit places where other people were present. He traded his solitude in nature for the safety of civilization. The nightmares continued for over a year. Robert would dream of massive hands tearing through his defenses, of intelligent eyes evaluating his worth, of being stalked through endless forests by something that was always just outside his peripheral vision. He would wake up reaching for weapons that weren't there, his heart pounding with the absolute certainty that something was watching him from the darkness beyond his bedroom window. Gradually, the intensity of these dreams faded, but they never disappeared entirely. Even now, 3 years after his encounter, Robert occasionally wakes up with the taste of that musky scent in his mouth and the phantom sensation of a massive hand pressing against his forehead. On those mornings he lies in bed and wonders if the creature is still out there, still patrolling those woods, still marking its territory and watching for intruders. Robert has never spoken publicly about his experience, despite numerous requests from cryptozoology enthusiasts and paranormal investigators who learned of his story through Dr. Walsh's research. He has no interest in becoming a celebrity in that community, no desire to profit from what was arguably the most terrifying experience of his life. For Robert, the encounter was deeply personal, a moment of contact with something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. He still owns his house in Macon, still lives the quiet life of a retired construction worker with his wife of 35 years. But Robert Greene is no longer the man who drove into those Georgia mountains with such confidence 3 years ago. He's been marked by his encounter with something that shouldn't exist, something that demonstrated its dominance over him and then chose to let him live. The question that haunts him isn't whether the creature was real. He has no doubt about that. The question is why it let him go. Sometimes, usually on overcast days, when the light has that particular quality he remembers from that morning in the woods, Robert finds himself wondering if the creature is still watching him. Not actively stalking, not threatening, but simply maintaining awareness of the human who wandered into its territory and lived to tell about it. The thought should be terrifying, but instead, Robert finds it oddly comforting. In a world where so much remains unknown, where science has mapped the genome but still can't explain consciousness, there's something reassuring about the possibility that mysteries still exist in the deep places of the world. Robert Greene fired a shot that morning that made something ancient and powerful very angry. But more importantly, he looked into eyes that held an intelligence he couldn't dismiss, couldn't rationalize away, couldn't forget. He survived an encounter with something that lives in the spaces between known and unknown, between legend and reality. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, Robert can still feel that massive hand against his forehead, still sense those intelligent eyes watching him from the darkness beyond his understanding. The creature let him go that day. Robert has never been certain why, but he's grateful for the mercy he was shown. He carries the scars of his encounter, both physical and psychological. But he also carries the knowledge that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than most people imagine. In the end, perhaps that knowledge is worth the price he paid for it. 3 years later, Robert Greene remains changed by those few hours in the Georgia mountains. He's a man who's seen something that challenged every assumption he'd made about the natural world, something that forced him to confront the limitations of human understanding. He's learned that there are still places where humans are not the dominant species, where ancient powers hold sway over territories that exist beyond the reach of civilization. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the air carries scents that remind him of that morning in the woods, Robert wonders if somewhere in those dark forests, a creature with intelligent eyes still remembers the hunter who wandered into its domain and lived to carry the tale back to a world that prefers its mysteries safely contained in books and movies, rather than walking on 2 legs through the deepest shadows of the wilderness. The next case. The October air carried that crisp bite that meant serious hunting weather was finally here. Cole Thompson adjusted his orange vest and checked his rifle one more time before shouldering his pack. At 43, he'd been hunting these Missouri woods for over 2 decades, following in his father's footsteps and his grandfather's before him. The Thompson family had been working this particular stretch of the Mark Twain National Forest since the 1960s, when Cole's grandfather first secured the hunting lease on the remote 2,000-acre parcel. Cole stood 6'2" with the weathered hands and steady gaze of a man who'd spent most of his adult life outdoors. His graying beard and the deep lines around his eyes spoke to countless hours scanning tree lines and reading sign. By trade, he was a mechanical engineer for Boeing in St. Louis, but every fiber of his being came alive during hunting season. His colleagues knew better than to schedule important meetings during the 3 weeks in November when Cole disappeared into the wilderness. The drive from his suburban St. Louis home to the hunting grounds took 2.5 hours, winding through increasingly rural Missouri countryside until asphalt gave way to gravel, then to the rutted dirt road that marked the entrance to what locals called the Thompson Tract. Cole had made this journey so many times he could navigate it in complete darkness, but this morning he savored every familiar landmark. The weathered barn with the faded mail pouch advertisement, the creek crossing where he'd seen his first deer as a 10-year-old, the massive oak tree split by lightning 3 summers ago. His destination was a carefully selected spot deep in the heart of the property, nearly 2 miles from the nearest road. Cole had been developing this particular hunting location for 5 years, strategically placing trail cameras, salt licks, and finally last season, the elevated deer stand that had become his favored position. The stand was a marvel of engineering that reflected both his professional background and his hunting obsession. A 12-foot-tall platform constructed from pressure-treated lumber and heavy-duty brackets, with a comfortable padded seat and shooting rails positioned for optimal coverage of 2 well-used deer trails. The hiking trail to the stand wound through dense hardwood forest, punctuated by small clearings where ancient oaks had fallen and created natural openings in the canopy. Cole had marked the route with reflective tacks every 50 yards, invisible to wildlife, but clearly visible to his trained eye. The forest floor crunched under his boots as he navigated between towering red oaks, white oaks, and hickories, their bare branches creating intricate patterns against the grey November sky. This particular section of the Mark Twain National Forest was known for producing exceptional white-tailed deer, partly due to its remoteness and partly due to the diverse habitat created by the Missouri Department of Conservation's selective timber management. Cole had been photographing and tracking deer movement patterns here for years, maintaining detailed journals that recorded everything from acorn production cycles to weather patterns and their effects on deer behavior. His methodical approach had earned him a reputation among local hunters as something of a deer whispering guru. The morning was unusually warm for late November, with temperatures hovering in the low 60s instead of the typical 30s. Cole noted this anomaly with the attention of someone whose success depended on reading environmental cues. Warm weather meant deer would be bedding in cooler, shadier areas during the day and moving later in the evening. It also meant scent control would be more challenging, as his human odor would travel farther in the humid air. As he approached the final quarter mile to his stand, Cole activated what he called his hunting mindset, a state of hyper-awareness where every sound, smell, and visual detail received conscious attention. His footsteps became more deliberate, his breathing more controlled. This was the mental transition from suburban engineer to apex predator, a transformation that connected him to something primal and essential that no amount of modern living could erase. The deer stand came into view through the trees, exactly as he'd left it 3 weeks earlier. The platform sat 12 feet above the ground, accessible by a series of ladder steps bolted directly into the trunk of a massive white oak. The tree itself was easily 4 feet in diameter, one of the monarchs of this particular forest section. Cole estimated its age at well over a century, possibly closer to 200 years old. The stand's position offered commanding views of a natural funnel where 2 ridgelines converged, forcing deer to follow predictable paths as they moved between bedding and feeding areas. Cole performed his standard pre-hunt ritual, checking every bolt and bracket that secured the stand to the tree. Safety was paramount in his mind. He'd known too many hunters who'd been injured or killed in falls from elevated positions. Every connection point received a visual inspection and a firm shake test. The ladder rungs were checked for stability, the platform examined for any signs of wear or weather damage. Only after this thorough inspection did he consider beginning his ascent. The climb to the platform required careful attention despite Cole's familiarity with the route. His rifle was secured across his back with a padded sling, and his day pack contained everything he might need for an extended sit. thermos of coffee, energy bars, first aid kit, GPS unit, two-way radio, and extra ammunition. Each rung of the ladder brought him higher into the canopy, where the perspective on the forest floor gradually expanded. From the platform, Cole could see nearly 100 yards in 3 directions, with the 4th direction blocked by the massive trunk of the oak itself. The elevated position offered not just visual advantages, but psychological ones as well. There was something deeply satisfying about claiming a high vantage point, something that appealed to the most ancient parts of human hunting instinct. Up here, Cole felt connected to countless generations of hunters who had sought similar advantages in pursuit of game. The morning routine continued with the careful arrangement of his gear, rifle positioned within easy reach, ammunition accessible, binoculars hung around his neck for quick deployment. Cole had learned through hard experience that the moment of opportunity rarely announced itself with fanfare. Success in hunting required constant readiness, the ability to transition from hours of patient observation to precise action in a matter of seconds. By 7:30, with legal shooting light fully established, Cole settled into the familiar rhythm of a hunting sit. His breathing slowed, his movements became minimal, his senses expanded to encompass the entire forest around him. This was meditation in its purest form, a complete immersion in the present moment that urban life rarely offered. Every sound carried meaning. The rustle of leaves that might indicate approaching game, the distant hammering of a woodpecker, the chattering of squirrels disturbed by something moving through their territory. The first hour passed without incident, which was typical for opening morning. Cole knew that deer in this area had been pressured by hunters on neighboring properties for the past week, making them more cautious and more likely to move during the middle of the day rather than at dawn and dusk. Patience was perhaps the most important hunting skill, and Cole had developed it through decades of practice. Around 9 o'clock, he noticed the first unusual sign. A flock of crows that had been feeding in the valley below suddenly erupted into flight, their harsh calls echoing through the forest. Cole studied the area where they'd been feeding, looking for any indication of what had disturbed them. Through his binoculars, he could see movement in the brush, too large and deliberate to be deer, too quiet to be another hunter. Whatever it was, moved with purpose through the heavy cover, staying just out of sight, but clearly following the same deer trail Cole had been watching. The movement stopped directly below his position, perhaps 40 yards away. Cole strained to identify what he was seeing, but the combination of shadows and thick underbrush made positive identification impossible. For nearly 10 minutes, something large remained motionless in that location. Cole could sense its presence, even when he couldn't see it directly, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath, the unnatural stillness that indicated a major predator was nearby. Finally, whatever it was moved on, continuing along the deer trail toward the creek bottom. Cole watched until it disappeared completely, then spent another 20 minutes scanning the area for any additional signs. His instincts told him this hadn't been a deer or any other common game animal. The movement patterns were wrong, the behavior too intelligent and deliberate, but Missouri's large predator population was limited to the occasional black bear and transient mountain lion, neither of which typically displayed such cautious, almost calculating behavior. The incident left Cole with a vague sense of unease that he couldn't quite rationalize. In his years of hunting, he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to read the forest's moods. Something felt different about this morning, as if the normal balance of predator and prey had been altered by the presence of something that didn't quite belong. He made a mental note to check his trail cameras later, hoping they might have captured whatever had disturbed the crows. By 11 o'clock, the forest had returned to its normal rhythm. Squirrels resumed their gathering activities, birds returned to their feeding patterns, and the tension that had gripped the woods earlier seemed to dissipate. Cole allowed himself to relax slightly, taking a long drink from his thermos and settling back into the patient observation mode that defined successful hunting. The warm weather was indeed affecting deer movement. Cole had seen exactly 2 does in 3 hours, both moving quickly through distant openings without offering shot opportunities. The thick canopy above trapped the heat and created an almost greenhouse effect that encouraged deer to seek cooler bedding areas. Cole adjusted his expectations accordingly, knowing that patience would be rewarded with better movement patterns later in the day. Around noon, Cole decided to eat lunch while maintaining his vigil. The energy bar and coffee constituted a hunter's feast, simple fuel that wouldn't interfere with his concentration or create unnecessary scent. As he ate, he reviewed his hunting plan for the remainder of the day. The evening hunt would likely be more productive, with deer beginning to move toward feeding areas as temperatures dropped. His position offered excellent coverage of the routes they would most likely use. The afternoon passed in the peculiar time dilation that characterized extended hunting sites. Minutes could feel like hours when nothing was happening, but Cole had learned to use this time productively, studying the forest in minute detail, cataloging every tree, rock, and landmark that might prove useful in low-light conditions. This level of environmental awareness had served him well throughout his hunting career, allowing him to make successful shots in conditions that would stymie less prepared hunters. Around 3 o'clock, Cole noticed his first deer of the afternoon, a young buck picking his way carefully along the far ridge. The animal was clearly nervous, stopping frequently to scan for danger, ears constantly rotating to catch any suspicious sound. Cole watched through his binoculars as the buck followed the ridgeline for nearly 10 minutes before disappearing into heavy cover. The deer's behavior reinforced Cole's sense that something was affecting normal movement patterns. As the afternoon wore on, Cole became increasingly aware of being watched. It was a subtle sensation at first, easily dismissed as hunter's paranoia, but it gradually intensified until he could no longer ignore it. The feeling seemed to emanate from the thick cover directly behind his position, an area his elevated stand couldn't effectively monitor. Several times, Cole turned in his seat to scan the area behind the oak tree, but the dense vegetation made observation impossible beyond 20 yards. The sensation of being observed was something Cole had experienced before, usually when other predators were in the area. He'd felt it during encounters with black bears and once during a memorable evening when a mountain lion had stalked to within 50 yards of his position. But this felt different, more intelligent, more deliberate. Whatever was out there seemed to be studying him with the same intensity he was using to study the forest. By 4 o'clock, the afternoon hunt was proving as unproductive as the morning session. Cole had seen a total of 4 deer, none offering shot opportunities, and the strange sense of being watched was beginning to affect his concentration. He found himself spending more time looking over his shoulder than watching the deer trails, a counterproductive development that went against everything he'd learned about successful hunting. The first sign of real trouble came without warning. Cole was scanning the valley bottom through his binoculars when he felt his platform shift slightly. At first, he attributed the movement to wind, but the afternoon air was completely still. He set down his binoculars and gripped the shooting rail, testing the platform's stability. Everything seemed solid, but the brief sensation of movement had been unmistakable. Cole checked his watch, 4:15. He had planned to hunt until dark, but the combination of poor deer movement and his growing unease was making him reconsider. Perhaps tomorrow would offer better conditions and a return to the normal forest dynamics he understood. As he debated whether to call it a day, Cole heard the first sound that genuinely alarmed him. From somewhere behind his position came a low, rumbling vocalization, unlike anything he'd heard in 2 decades of hunting these woods. It wasn't quite a growl, not exactly a roar, but something that seemed to combine elements of both. The sound lasted only a few seconds, but it carried an undercurrent of intelligence and intention that raised every hair on Cole's arms. Whatever made that sound was large, powerful, and uncomfortably close to his position. Cole turned in his seat, trying to pinpoint the source of the vocalization. The sound had seemed to come from perhaps 50 yards behind the oak tree, deep in the heavy cover, where visibility was limited to 10 or 15 yards. As he strained to see any movement in that direction, Cole realized that the forest had fallen completely silent. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no insect noise. The absolute silence that indicated every living thing in the area was hiding. The platform shifted again, more noticeably this time. Cole gripped the shooting rail with both hands and looked down at the ladder connections. Everything appeared secure, but he could definitely feel movement in the tree itself. It was as if something large was pressing against the trunk from the opposite side, testing the oak's stability or perhaps investigating the unusual structure attached to it. Cole's engineering background kicked in as he tried to calculate what kind of force would be required to move a tree of this size. The white oak had to weigh several tons and was deeply rooted in soil that hadn't been disturbed for decades. Whatever was causing the movement possessed extraordinary strength, far beyond anything Cole had encountered in the Missouri wilderness. The movement stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving Cole gripping the rails and straining to detect any further disturbance. For several minutes, the forest remained locked in unnatural silence. Cole found himself holding his breath, listening for any sound that might indicate what was happening on the ground below. His rational mind tried to provide explanations, perhaps a large bear investigating the human scent around the tree, or even a bulldozer from a distant logging operation creating vibrations through the ground. But Cole's instincts, honed by years of hunting experience, rejected these rational explanations. The sounds, the movement, the overwhelming sense of being observed by something intelligent, all of it pointed toward an encounter with something far outside his normal experience. Cole began to consider the possibility that he needed to leave his elevated position immediately. As if responding to his thoughts, the attack on his tree stand began in earnest. What started as gentle testing movements escalated into deliberate, powerful impacts against the opposite side of the oak. Each impact sent shockwaves through the tree that Cole could feel in his bones. The platform began to sway with each hit, the careful engineering of his stand's construction suddenly seeming inadequate against whatever force was being applied. Cole grabbed his rifle and tried to position himself to see around the tree trunk, but the oak's massive girth made observation impossible. The impacts continued with mechanical regularity, each one slightly stronger than the last, as if whatever was causing them was systematically testing the tree's limits. Cole realized with growing horror that this wasn't random animal behavior. Something was deliberately trying to bring down his deer stand. The first bracket failure came with a sharp crack that cut through the afternoon air like a gunshot. Cole felt the platform drop 6 inches on one side before the remaining connections caught the load. He looked down to see one of the heavy-duty steel brackets that secured his stand to the tree dangling uselessly, its bolts sheared off by forces far exceeding their design limits. Cole keyed his two-way radio with trembling hands, trying to reach his hunting partner, who was supposed to be working a stand 3 miles away. Static filled the speaker, with no response to his increasingly urgent calls for assistance. The radio had worked perfectly that morning, but now seemed completely dead. Cole switched to his cell phone, only to discover he had no signal, despite usually having adequate coverage in this area. The impacts against the tree intensified, coming faster and with greater force. Cole could hear the oak itself beginning to creak and groan under the assault, sounds he'd never heard from the massive tree in all his years hunting from this location. A second bracket failed with another sharp crack, followed immediately by a third. The platform tilted dramatically, forcing Cole to grab the tree trunk to prevent falling 12 feet to the forest floor. Through his terror, Cole found himself trying to observe and catalog what was happening. His scientific training demanded that he gather data even in the face of mortal danger. The impacts were coming from something approximately 7 feet tall, based on the sound patterns, something with enormous upper body strength capable of moving a tree that should have been immovable. The rhythm was too consistent to be random. This was planned, purposeful destruction. Cole made the decision to abandon his stand while he still could. With only 2 brackets still holding the platform, he estimated he had perhaps minutes before complete structural failure. He slung his rifle across his back and prepared to descend the ladder, but as he swung his leg over the platform edge, the final assault began. The impacts came in rapid succession now, a drumbeat of destruction that shook the entire tree. Cole could hear what sounded like massive hands slapping against the oak's trunk with superhuman force. The remaining brackets began to give way one by one, each failure announced by the sharp crack of shearing metal. Cole scrambled for the ladder, but before he could begin his descent, the inevitable happened. With a grinding roar of failing metal and splintering wood, the deer stand tore free from the oak tree. Cole felt himself falling through space, the platform rotating as it dropped toward the forest floor. Time seemed to slow as his mind processed the physics of the fall. 12 feet was survivable if he landed correctly, potentially fatal if he didn't. Cole tried to push away from the falling platform, hoping to avoid being crushed by the heavy structure. The impact drove the breath from his lungs and sent lightning bolts of pain through his left leg. Cole hit the ground hard, with the platform crashing down beside him, missing his head by inches. For several seconds, he lay motionless, taking inventory of his injuries while trying to process what had just happened. His left leg was definitely broken. He could feel the fracture in his tibia, and any attempt to move sent waves of agony through his entire body. Cole's rifle had been thrown clear in the fall and lay 10 feet away, well beyond his reach in his current condition. His pack had come partially open, scattering supplies across the forest floor. Most critically, his radio and cell phone were both damaged and non-functional. Cole realized with growing panic that he was completely alone, injured, and miles from the nearest help. As he lay helpless on the forest floor, Cole became aware of new sounds from the far side of the oak tree. Heavy footsteps were moving around the tree's base, accompanied by what sounded like deep, rumbling breathing. Whatever had destroyed his stand was now investigating the results of its handiwork. Cole tried to remain perfectly still, hoping that playing dead might convince his attacker to lose interest and move on. The footsteps circled the tree slowly, deliberately, pausing occasionally as if their owner was examining specific details of the destruction. Cole could hear the sounds of the ruined deer stand being moved, heavy pieces of metal and wood being manipulated by something with extraordinary strength. The investigation continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, during which Cole barely dared to breathe. Finally, the footsteps approached Cole's position. He could hear something large moving through the brush, directly toward him, making no attempt at stealth. Cole squeezed his eyes shut and tried to control his breathing, but his broken leg was making it impossible to remain completely still. Small, involuntary movements of pain kept betraying his consciousness. When the sniffing began, Cole nearly lost control entirely. Hot breath washed over his face and neck as something enormous leaned down to examine him. The smell was unlike anything Cole had ever encountered, a mixture of wet fur, musk, and something else that his human senses couldn't quite categorize. The breathing was deep and deliberate, as if his examiner was cataloging his scent for future reference. Cole felt rough fingers touching his face, gently but with obvious strength. The texture was unlike human skin, coarser, more leathery, with what felt like thick calluses. The fingers traced across his features with surprising delicacy, as if their owner was trying to understand what manner of creature had invaded its territory. Cole could sense intelligence in the examination, a deliberate curiosity that was somehow more terrifying than simple animal aggression would have been. The examination continued for several minutes, during which Cole remained frozen between genuine unconsciousness and complete terror. His broken leg throbbed with each heartbeat, but he didn't dare acknowledge the pain in any way that might provoke an aggressive response. Whatever was examining him possessed the physical capability to kill him instantly, and Cole's survival depended entirely on its continued restraint. Eventually, the examination ended. Cole heard his investigator moving away from his position, the heavy footsteps gradually fading into the distance. For a long time after the sounds disappeared completely, Cole remained motionless, afraid that any movement might bring his attacker back. Only when the forest began to return to its normal sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering, did Cole dare to open his eyes and assess his situation. The late afternoon sun was slanting through the canopy at a steep angle, indicating that several hours had passed since his fall. Cole's left leg had swollen significantly and was causing intense pain with even the slightest movement. His water bottle had survived the fall intact, but most of his other supplies were scattered and damaged. Most critically, both his radio and cell phone were completely inoperable, leaving him with no way to call for help. Cole tried to remember his survival training from his military service 20 years earlier. First priority was always shelter and signaling, but his broken leg made mobility nearly impossible. The scattered remains of his deer stand might provide materials for a shelter, but Cole lacked the strength to drag the heavy components into a useful configuration. His best hope was that his hunting partner would notice his absence and initiate a search. The pain in his leg was becoming overwhelming, and Cole realized he was probably going into shock. His vision was beginning to tunnel, and he felt nauseated and disoriented. Cole forced himself to drink water and tried to position his broken leg in a way that minimized the pain, but every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his entire body. He began to understand that his situation was genuinely life-threatening. As darkness approached, Cole heard his attacker returning. The same heavy footsteps circled his position at a distance, as if their owner was maintaining surveillance but didn't want to approach too closely. Occasionally, Cole caught glimpses of a massive shadow moving between the trees, but the combination of fading light and his pain-induced disorientation made positive identification impossible. The night passed in a haze of pain and terror. Cole drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes awakening to find his guardian still circling his position in the darkness. During his lucid moments, Cole tried to process what was happening to him. His scientific mind sought rational explanations for the day's events, but the evidence pointed towards something far outside normal experience. Whatever had destroyed his deer stand possessed intelligence, enormous physical strength, and seemed to be maintaining a protective watch over his injured form. The behavior was unlike any documented animal species Cole knew of, and the physical evidence, the destroyed platform, the examination by obviously non-human hands, suggested an encounter with something that shouldn't exist according to conventional zoology. Dawn brought both relief and fresh concerns. Cole's protector had apparently departed sometime during the night, leaving him alone with his injuries and his desperate need for rescue. His broken leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size and was causing constant, overwhelming pain. Cole's water supply was running low, and he was beginning to experience the disorientation that indicated serious dehydration. Around mid-morning, Cole heard the distant sound of a vehicle on the dirt road that accessed the hunting area. Hope surged through him as he realized his hunting partner had probably arrived to check on his absence from their evening rendezvous point. Cole tried to shout for help, but his voice was weak and hoarse from dehydration and wouldn't carry far through the dense forest. The rescue came just before noon, when Jake Morrison finally followed Cole's marked trail to the deer stand location. Jake's shouts of alarm as he discovered the destruction echoed through the forest. followed by his urgent calls for medical assistance on his radio. Cole had never been so glad to see another human being in his entire life. Jake's first priority was stabilizing Cole's broken leg and getting fluids into his dehydrated system. As a volunteer paramedic, Jake had the basic medical supplies and training needed to prepare Cole for transport to a hospital. While Jake worked, Cole tried to explain what had happened, but his account sounded incredible even to his own ears. A more detailed debriefing would have to wait until Cole received proper medical treatment. The evacuation took nearly 3 hours, with Jake calling in additional volunteers to help carry Cole out to the nearest accessible road. The journey was agonizing for Cole, but the presence of other people and the prospect of medical treatment gave him strength he hadn't possessed during his night alone in the forest. By late afternoon, Cole was in the emergency room of the county hospital, receiving the orthopedic care his fractured tibia required. The official accident report filed by the conservation officers was straightforward. Experienced hunter suffered platform failure resulting in fall and injury. Jake corroborated the basic facts: destroyed deer stand, injured hunter, successful rescue, without going into detail about Cole's more unusual claims. The investigating officers noted the extensive damage to the stand, but attributed it to structural failure rather than external forces. Cole's recovery required 6 weeks in a cast, followed by months of physical therapy. During this time, he had ample opportunity to reflect on his experience and consider its implications. His rational mind continued to seek conventional explanations for what had happened, but the physical evidence and his clear memories resisted easy rationalization. Something extraordinary had occurred in those Missouri woods, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the natural world. 3 months after his accident, Cole returned to the site of his destroyed deer stand. The oak tree bore obvious scars from the attack, deep gouges in the bark at a height of 7 to 8 feet, marks that could only have been made by something with incredible strength and obvious intelligence. Cole measured the marks carefully, photographed them from multiple angles, and tried to find any conventional explanation for their existence. The more Cole investigated, the more convinced he became that his encounter had been genuine. Trail camera footage from the days following his accident showed large bipedal figures moving through the forest at night. Shadows at the edge of the camera's range, but clearly not human in their proportions or movement patterns. Cole began to understand that he had encountered something that science didn't officially recognize, but that clearly existed in the deep forests of Missouri. Cole's decision to go public with his story came gradually. Initially, he shared his experience only with close family and friends, most of whom responded with polite skepticism. But as Cole researched similar encounters reported by other hunters and outdoor enthusiasts, he realized his experience was part of a much larger pattern of unexplained phenomena occurring throughout North America's wilderness areas. The response to Cole's story was mixed. Fellow hunters generally treated him with respect, acknowledging that something unusual had clearly happened, even if they couldn't accept his interpretation of events. Skeptics dismissed his account as misidentification combined with trauma-induced hallucination. Researchers interested in unknown species found his detailed observations and physical evidence compelling enough to warrant serious investigation. Cole's life changed fundamentally after his encounter. His perspective on the natural world expanded to include possibilities he had never previously considered. The confidence that had characterized his hunting career was replaced by a more humble recognition that humans understood far less about their environment than they assumed. Cole continued to hunt, but never again with the casual certainty that had marked his earlier years in the field. The psychological impact of Cole's experience proved as significant as the physical trauma of his broken leg. Nightmares featuring his examination by unknown hands persisted for months after his recovery. Cole found himself constantly alert for signs of observation when in the wilderness, never quite able to relax into the meditative state that had previously made hunting so rewarding. The sense of being a guest in someone else's territory never completely left him. 5 years after his encounter, Cole received a call from a researcher affiliated with the Olympic Project, a scientific organization investigating reports of unknown primates in North America. The researcher had obtained Cole's contact information through a network of people interested in such phenomena and wanted to interview him about his experience. Cole agreed to participate, recognizing that scientific investigation might eventually provide answers to questions that had haunted him for years. The interview process was exhaustive, covering every detail of Cole's encounter from multiple perspectives. The researcher was particularly interested in the behavioral observations Cole had made, the systematic destruction of his deer stand, the gentle examination while he was injured, the apparent protective surveillance during his night alone in the forest. These behavioral patterns matched observations reported by other witnesses, suggesting consistent patterns rather than random encounters. Cole learned that his experience was far from unique. Hundreds of similar encounters had been reported throughout North America, many by credible witnesses with extensive outdoor experience. The consistency of the behavioral descriptions across multiple witnesses and geographic locations suggested that a real phenomenon was being documented, even if mainstream science remained reluctant to acknowledge its existence. The physical evidence from Cole's encounter became part of a growing database of information being compiled by researchers. The photographs of the scarred oak tree, the measurements of the gouges in the bark, the documentation of the destroyed deer stand, all of it contributed to a scientific understanding of phenomena that official zoology continued to dismiss as folklore. Cole's decision to participate in this research network connected him with other witnesses who had undergone similar experiences. The mutual support and validation provided by these connections proved invaluable in processing the psychological impact of his encounter. Cole discovered that many witnesses shared his sense of having been fundamentally changed by their experiences. Their worldview expanded to include possibilities that mainstream society wasn't prepared to acknowledge. The question of whether to carry weapons during future hunting trips became a significant concern for Cole. His encounter had demonstrated that conventional firearms would be inadequate against something with the size and strength of his forest visitor. More importantly, the gentle treatment he had received while injured suggested that his visitor possessed moral restraint that made aggressive responses inappropriate. Cole eventually decided to continue hunting unarmed. Trusting that respect for his visitor's territory would be reciprocated, Cole's return to active hunting required significant psychological preparation. His first trips back to the forest were accompanied by anxiety attacks that made extended sights impossible. The hypervigilance that had developed after his encounter interfered with the patient observation skills that successful hunting required. Cole worked with a counselor experienced in wilderness trauma to develop coping strategies that would allow him to function effectively in the forest environment. Gradually, Cole's confidence returned, but it was a different kind of confidence than he had possessed before his encounter. Where he had once felt like a master of the wilderness, Cole now understood himself to be a visitor whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. This shift in perspective actually improved his hunting success, as his increased awareness and respect for the forest's rhythms made him a more effective observer of wildlife behavior. The scientific community's response to Cole's evidence and testimony reflected the broader challenges facing researchers investigating unknown species. While the quality of Cole's observations and the consistency of his account with other reports impressed individual scientists, institutional support for such research remained limited. The stigma associated with cryptozoological investigation prevented many qualified researchers from pursuing questions that might have significant scientific value. Cole's experience with media attention following his decision to go public proved largely negative. Sensationalized reporting that focused on the more dramatic aspects of his encounter while ignoring the careful behavioral observations and physical evidence frustrated Cole's attempts to contribute to serious scientific discussion. The reduction of his complex experience to simple entertainment reinforced his appreciation for the researchers who took such phenomena seriously. The long-term impact of Cole's encounter extended beyond his personal hunting activities to influence his professional life as well. His engineering work increasingly focused on remote monitoring systems that might be useful for wildlife observation. Cole began volunteering his technical expertise to researchers developing camera traps and acoustic monitoring equipment designed to document the presence of unknown species in wilderness areas. 10 years after his encounter, Cole returned to the site of his destroyed deer stand for an extended camping trip. The oak tree had healed from its scars, but the marks remained visible to anyone who knew where to look. Cole spent 3 days in the area, not hunting but simply observing and remembering. On his final night, he heard the same deep vocalizations that had preceded his original encounter, distant but unmistakable. Cole's response to hearing those calls again surprised him. Rather than fear, he felt a complex mixture of gratitude and recognition. His visitor had spared his life when he was helpless and defenseless, displaying a moral capacity that challenged assumptions about intelligence and empathy in the natural world. Cole realized that his encounter had been a privilege rather than a trauma, an opportunity to witness something extraordinary that few humans would ever experience. The camping trip marked a turning point in Cole's relationship with his experience. He stopped seeing himself as a victim of an attack and began understanding his encounter as a form of contact between two intelligent species sharing the same environment. This reframing allowed Cole to move beyond the trauma and begin appreciating the profound implications of what he had witnessed. Cole's story continues to evolve as new evidence and witness reports expand the scientific understanding of unknown primate species in North America. His detailed observations and physical evidence remain valuable contributions to research that may eventually lead to official recognition of species that currently exist only in the testimonies of witnesses like Cole. Whether such recognition occurs in his lifetime or not, Cole knows that his encounter fundamentally changed his understanding of what's possible in the natural world. The broken leg that resulted from his fall healed completely, but Cole considers it a small price to pay for the privilege of his encounter. His deer stand was never rebuilt. Cole decided that the spot should remain undisturbed out of respect for its previous inhabitant. He continues to hunt the Thompson family tract, but always with the awareness that he shares the forest with something that preceded him and will likely remain long after he's gone. Cole's experience serves as a reminder that despite humanity's technological advancement and environmental dominance, mysteries still exist in the world's wild places. His encounter suggests that intelligence and awareness may be more widespread in the natural world than science currently recognizes, and that respect for unknown phenomena may be more appropriate than dismissal or exploitation. The lessons Cole learned from his encounter extend beyond questions of unknown species to broader issues of human relationships with the natural world. His experience demonstrated that wilderness areas harbor more complexity and mystery than conventional understanding suggests, and that humility and respect are appropriate responses to encountering phenomena beyond current scientific explanation. Today, Cole continues to share his story with researchers and witnesses, contributing to a growing body of evidence that challenges conventional zoological understanding. His account stands as testimony to the possibility that Earth's wilderness areas may harbor intelligent species that have successfully avoided scientific documentation while maintaining their own complex relationships with the ecosystems they inhabit. The collapsed deer stand in Missouri represents more than just a hunting accident. It symbolizes the moment when one human being's understanding of reality expanded to include possibilities that mainstream science has yet to acknowledge. Cole Thompson's encounter may eventually be recognized as an early documentation of one of the most significant zoological discoveries in human history. Or it may remain a mystery that challenges the boundaries between the known and unknown worlds. Either way, Cole's experience demonstrates that the wilderness continues to hold secrets that resist human understanding, and that respect for these mysteries may be humanity's most appropriate response to the unknown. His story serves as both a cautionary tale about the limits of human knowledge and an inspiring reminder that the natural world retains its capacity to surprise, challenge, and transform those who approach it with open minds and respectful hearts.